sleepless nights, coffee houses, clubs, and neon lights. I rock the people my way, working my way, coming back to you. Working my way, coming back. Take me home tonight, not wasting any time. Highway 95, engines on overdrive. From town to town, and in between, I see you in the morning light. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, LA, I still see your face. Buses roll, distance grows, but I remember you're just a dream away. Working my way, coming back to you. Working my way, coming back. Take me home tonight, not wasting any time. Highway 95, engines on overdrive. From town to town, and in between, I see you in the morning light. Take me home tonight, not wasting any time. Highway 95, engines on overdrive. From town to town, and in between, I see you in the morning light. Take me home tonight, not wasting any time. Highway 95, engines on overdrive. From town to town, and in between, I see you in the morning light. Take me home tonight, not wasting any time. Highway 95, engines on overdrive. From town to town, and in between.
And welcome to What Are the Odds with Barnes and Baris. Robert will join us looking like 2:30 or so, or a little bit right around there. All right, so the biggest thing I think today is that Ron DeSantis, and I'm going to move in. I want to talk about Iowa today so we can talk about Pennsylvania. The greater picture here, which is that a lot of weird things are going on in the states. We just had an election. We got a ton of data attributes. It should be showing one thing. It's not. It's showing something very different. So we'll talk about that. But big news that I have to mention today, which we'll talk more about with Robert, is Ron DeSantis signing this bill that allows Floridians to sue social media big tech for money. So, for instance, for banning PBD or suspending it without an actual ruling, perhaps Twitter could be sued for that because of loss of revenue, maybe. I don't know. But that's something we'll discuss. But here we go again. We have Ron DeSantis on the offensive, while the rest of the Republicans in D.C., for sure, are on the defensive. All right? And that is a big story that's developing. You have some good, solid Republican governors and legislatures going on the offensive. You have legislatures who want to do election reform, while Democrats try, not only on the federal level, but on the state level, to, in a piecemeal fashion, make permanent what they did after the 2020 election, which is, again, using COVID as a pretext to weaken our election integrity and change long-standing election policy. All right? And they want to make that permanent. So you have some Republican legislatures going on the offensive there, trying to do something about it. You have some Republican governors who are trying to be offensive about their risks for long-term viability as a national party, as a party at all. The Republican Party faces risks. It's really beyond risk. Challenges. You cannot be an effective national party if you have it's a one-sided game with big tech. The damage Google did to their electoral prospects, the damage Twitter did to their electoral prospects, blocking out the New York Post so they can't report on Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and the Chinese and Ukraine and everything else. 20 to 25 points lower in battleground states awareness of those reports versus how many people were aware of the Hillary Clinton email scandal. And we know because we asked. All right? So it's a big deal. It's a big deal, and I want to mention it. But let's save that for later. All right, if you're in locals, all right, then you got the full report. But let me just give a breakdown to everybody of Iowa. All right, remember, red is obviously Republican. We know and identify these people as Republican votes. Blue, of course, is Democrat. Purple is unknown or other. Okay, and actually in Iowa we do have others. And there's a sliver of green in there, which you probably won't be able to visually see because they are so small. Let's look at statewide, county by county, and then we'll look at congressional district. All right? Which is going to go to the heart of why Republicans in D.C. are weak, ineffective, and are at this point a hindrance to the party growing and winning. All right, first, let's look at counties. Iowa. The small, relatively population-wise, small state of Iowa is home to the largest number of pivot counties in the United States. 31 from 2012 and on. What do I mean by that? These are counties that vote with typically the inevitable presidential winner, and that they swung from Barack Obama to Donald Trump from 2012 to 2016. From 2016 to 2020, notable fact about Iowa, which is why it stands out, even though it's a relatively white state, why Iowa stands out so much is because it has the most pivot counties over 60 years. Over 60 years. These counties predicted the inevitable winner more than 70% of the time. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? These are not particularly partisan counties. Yes, they are white, but they tend, and have tended, to swing back and forth with the winner. All right, so we analyze statewide. Over 2 million unique individuals. All right, and again, if you're on locals, you got this entire report. This is one of the biggest reports we've sent out. They get really big. So it's hard to just upload a PDF to the Big Data Poll website or something because they get huge. All right. So typically we print them out. All right. But and we use them for our internal purposes. But we're doing this for the locals community. Overall, statewide, it may shock you to know that the state is just a little over R+1. All right. This is with all of these new data attributes. The state for registrations is just a little over R+1. Now, just like Wisconsin, it's got a big chunk of independents. Over 32% is either none, and then a little under 1 is other. All right, so altogether, we're looking at a little over around 33%, about a third of the state is none or other. This is why Iowa can be so swingy, and the Republican Party would be foolish to think without Donald Trump on the ballot, they're going to keep this state. It is incorrect for Bret Baier to characterize Iowa as a red state. It is a Trump red state, but it is not a red state. Iowa voted 12 points for Barack Obama against John McCain. It voted over 6 points for Barack Obama over Mitt Romney. It is not a red state. It voted about just under 10 points for Donald Trump in 16, and it voted just slightly less. Not a lot. Just slightly less for Joe Biden. And honestly, that could be attributed to third parties not being as serious as they were in 16. All right, but no big swing here. In fact, many of these pivot counties, out of all of them, only 2 moved in any direction to Joe Biden. One by 0.84%, 0.82%, and another one by about 1.5. The rest of them either stayed the same or moved toward even further Donald Trump. And with Donald Trump on the ballot, he greatly helped Joni Ernst, who won easily re-election, a race that was supposed to be not only competitive, but one that Democrats seriously thought they could win. All right? So here we have this pie. You can clearly see what's going on here. Look, this is what's important here. You guys got to remember this. The purple in Iowa is not as dangerous to Republicans as the purple in Wisconsin that we went over last week. In Wisconsin, Republicans solidified. They consolidated all of their own independent vote, or the bulk of their independent vote. And Democrats just have a weaker party loyalty in Wisconsin. So it's like R11. But with those independents who will go and tell an exit pollster or tell a regular pollster, yeah, I'm a Democrat, they can get them to the polls better than Republicans do with their share of the other unknown independent, whatever you call it, whatever you want to call it, combined. All purple combined. In Iowa, these are not left-wing people. They are not left-wing people. All right, the state is about 52 female, 48 male. And in Wisconsin, we've seen at 51 men, the electorate, all right? But if you go through, look, I mean, 250 plus is like 2.3%. Unknown is quite a chunk. We don't know, when you go and sign up for voter registration, you don't give them your income. Somebody says, oh, well, how much you make a year? That's not how it works. This is inferred by data attributes that we use, hundreds of them. And you can see that Iowa is a much more conservative. Off the bat, we know that more than 41% of Iowa is married off the bat, voter registration wise. All right, a 27% single. Inferred single is very small. Inferred married is very small, but it's still 3 times the size of inferred single. All right, so we know this is a more politically right-leaning state. It's more conservative, but it is working class. It's very populist. It's extremely populist. So Asians, very small percentage of population. Caucasian, 90+%. So it is, of course, a very white state, as we know. Completed college, 25% we know did. Completed high school, at least 23% we know. Completed grad school, about 5%. Now, the voting electorate's going to be a lot more than that, but it's a small graduate school state, even with inference. So we can see Donald Trump in 16 carried every single age group in Iowa. And when we put out our polling for Iowa, Ohio, Florida, and we showed from 30 up, Trump was dominating in these states. In Ohio, he was carrying 18 to 29-year-olds. In Florida, he carried 30 to 44s. Those are millennials. We were talking about this on Twitter earlier. It was a big shift. It mattered. And in 16, there was a bit of a hint that that was going to happen. In some of these states, being young does not necessarily mean Democrats can count on you for a vote. It's at least 55% Protestant, which we know is actually probably a little bit more than that. Evangelical, we estimated around a third. About a third of the electorate being evangelical, with nearly 3 out of 4 voting for Donald Trump. So it's not, parts of this look more like Wisconsin. Like I said, Wisconsin's a funny state. It looks, Wisconsin and Iowa share more than Wisconsin and Pennsylvania do. Wisconsin has a surprisingly high number of evangelicals. It was 2 points actually higher than Iowa 4 years ago. And it voted at roughly the same rate for the Republican candidate. So that's why, again, this is a state that was never competitive. It was not competitive. Never. Not in this election. Now, if you look at, and we're going to go to the congressional districts in a second here. If you look at the polling, you can see where people were polled, who these people talking to. Then I can understand why it leans slightly to Biden a little bit. But it was never competitive. When I mean lean slightly, the raw data still came in 3-4 points at least more pro-Trump than other states. If you were to average them out. Ohio was never competitive. The raw was plus 10. It was very close to what the actual result was. Same thing with Iowa. So I don't know how any of these came out and shook out like this. All of those polls. But this is a smaller population, so maybe that's why we're seeing a little bit more realistic result. This is very typical for Iowa. This is very close to what we had seen before the election in 2020. So, again, we're just seeing these weird results. Wisconsin gets significantly 6 points more Republican after the election. Virginia gets 4 points more Republican after the election. You'll see Pennsylvania 5.5 points more. Let me just be a spoiler alert. Pennsylvania in the voter file, Democrats still had a huge wealth of voters that they could tap in Pennsylvania going into November. Overall, if it was just the entire universe, it was D plus 11. It's D plus 6 right now. That's not putting in the 90% certainty to vote modeling, which is what Republicans used to have to rely on to be able to outvote Democrats in some of these states. That is no longer the case in Pennsylvania, which can help explain some of the results we saw with the initiatives. Even though there were Democratic primaries, important Democratic primaries, Republicans won both specials and the 2 initiatives. Because obviously lockdown was the Democrat position. Anti-lockdown was the Republican position. Republicans made up 44% of the electorate. Again, spoiler alert, Republicans used to be in the high 20s and then Trump brought them into the 30s. Now in Pennsylvania, Republicans are 4 in 10. They start out at 40%. Democrats start out at around 46%. So that's why they still have the edge there. Very, very tiny population of independent voters. But Republicans have not been more than 4 in 10 in Pennsylvania. Actually, they never have been. As far as as long as I have been around, they have never been. All right? It just isn't, it's just not the reality. So, what does this all tell us? Let's go to congressional districts. So you have this story about Frank Luntz, which I told you all, the man was a fraud. His polling, his focus groups are the views of his clients manipulated and pushed off onto the public through media, his friends in the media and other phony channels as legitimate research. But this is who Kevin McCarthy invites to come and tell them how to win in 2022. Because they believe the likes of Frank Luntz and even the House Democrats, they tout. You think they don't take their polling on Capitol Hill and throw it all over the place and tout it? They show it to colleagues. They show it to media outlets. And Nancy Pelosi's polling told her she was going to romp. That, of course, did not happen. But what it did do was scare the cowardly little Republicans under the table. They ran to defend the races that they typically run to defend. And they didn't look for places where they could go on the offense because they did not believe it. One of those districts was in Iowa, the one and only one that they didn't win. They lost it barely. In the 1st congressional district, let's take a look. Okay, here we go. This is by congressional district. The 1st congressional district, as many of you may or may not know, is in the southeastern part of the state. Okay? And here, let me get up the exact numbers for you guys so you can see. Oh, crap. I shouldn't have even done that. Let me just use it on preview. If you guys got this on locals, you're following along. But for everybody who doesn't, give me a hot second here. All right. So in CD1, Democrats have about a 4-point edge, a little over actually, a 4-point edge. 34.99% Democrat, which is about 177,955 versus 155,023, which comes to 30.48 or 30.5 if you round up. So Democrats have about a 4.5-point edge in CD1. So they look at, a D+4, D+5 race. They believe the likes of Frank Luntz and all of these other horrible pollsters, and they make really bad decisions and barely lose another seat that they could have won. This seat moved since 2018. I want to say, what was this, a 9-point swing? Let me get up the rest. Yeah, it was one of the biggest movers around the country. It was right. I mean, it's not up there with, the 30-point move in Minnesota, the 20-point move in Hawaii, Wisconsin 3, Texas 15, and on down the line. All seats Republicans could have won if they didn't believe bad data. So you can see, while Democrats have an edge, if independents side with Republicans, there isn't a place in Iowa they cannot compete. Not only cannot compete, there isn't a district in Iowa Republicans can't and shouldn't have won. They should have all 4 congressional seats in this state. And they wasted their opportunity to put an incumbent in. And it'll be harder now. It will be harder now for Republicans to get that district because it's hard to unseat an incumbent. You have a president on the ballot who wins the state by 10 points almost. That would be your time to take over the district. They did do probably better than they thought, probably shocked them themselves. I have no doubt. But it was not as good as they could have done or should have done. Again, 31 pivot counties in the state of Iowa. The highest number of pivot counties in the whole country. And not a single one of them pivoted back to Joe Biden. Not one. Not one. If you look at all of these counties on a map, from the south all the way to the southeast and up into the eastern side of the state, all the way north. You have a couple in the north central, northwestern. I mean, they're pretty much everywhere except for the west. The west is pretty solidly conservative. Or pretty solidly Republican. It's more Republican. So most of the pivots kind of move like a sideways U around the state. Not one pivoted back to Joe Biden. And by the way, Iowa is not the only place that did this. Vigo County in Indiana. You get very first results early in the night. Kentucky, Indiana. These are the results that roll in. So we know what to look for immediately. Donald Trump, Vigo County, 2016, plus 15. Donald Trump, Vigo County, 2020, plus 15. Not a whole lot of movement there. Certainly not a lot that you would think is warranted the swing of these other states. But it is what it is, right? And moving on to Pennsylvania, what you're going to see is that general idea of Chuck Schumer saying, for every working class Western Pennsylvanian voter we lose, we pick up 3 in the Southeast, in the Philadelphia suburbs. That is not true. It never was true, but you're really seeing it's not true now. The state has shifted significantly more Republican. And I have to tell you that 30 to 44, which is it's millennial, that shift among those voters in 2020 is probably the most untold story, underreported at the very least, of the 2020 election. Republicans have a very difficult time winning these votes. They try to rack it up with the 65 plus, that's their strongest category, and they try to do better than they typically do with 45 to 65 and a 64 in a normal year, and that's their winning coalition. That is not what we were seeing this last election. And in fact, in 2016, the handwriting was already on the wall. Trump did a little bit worse with some older white voters, but did significantly better among those that are 30 to 44. By the way, go back and look at the election 2020 public polling project. Click on Florida, and you will see our nice little plus 2.4 or whatever it was in that 30 to 44 category in Florida. It was Trump plus 2 and change. And he won them by just about that amount, while falling a little bit with some older voters. But because he just didn't fall enough. So it was a dominating performance either way. All right. So where do the Republicans go from here? Where do they go from here? Do they go backward and try to win over some of these other voters and risk the potential of isolating these people? Is that the smart bet? Should they throw all of these voters in Iowa and Ohio and Florida away over a prayer that they may be able to do better in a place like Virginia? Is that the way to go? Republicans better get their heads out of their butts. Over the weekend, speaking to a couple of people out in California, they're still in this old mindset. California's districts are about to shift pretty dramatically. David Vladio, he was already in deep trouble. Young Kim, right? Hell of a campaigner. Mike Garcia is a better model when it comes to how you win a tough district than the people that they prop up over there. The problem out there is that they don't really have the pulse of what remains of their base. Now, that's the problem everywhere, but in California, it's about to get a lot worse. They should forget about holding on to these districts that they can barely hold on to. That's playing defense. When you are on the defense in politics, you're losing. You need to look for new opportunities. And I'm telling you, I'm here to tell you right now, they are the NRCC, the RNC. Some state parties are a little bit more realistic than others, but in California, they're stale, man. They are stuck in their old way of thinking. And that way of thinking will lead to nothing but a shrinking, tinier and tinier, ever shrinking pool of potential seats that they may or may not be able to defend by a 2-3 point margin. That's a losing proposition. That's a losing strategy. As opposed to Democrats, who are very smart and say, you know what? This isn't a great state for us. But I think if we make the effort, Georgia 7 could be ours one day. Maybe the 5th could be ours one day. The 3rd can be ours one day. Sure, Ileana Rose Lathanam does really well down in South Florida right now. She wins by double digits. But one day she's going to retire. And if we put the work in, I think we could probably take Florida 27. Arizona's another one. Republicans used to dominate congressional districts in that state. Now they're crossing them off the list. Yet Republicans had no idea that Texas 15 was going to swing like that. Trust me, they had no idea. They were prepping for the ship to go down, man. That's what they were doing. They had no clue the vote was going to come in that strong for them. And had they not listened to the likes of Luntz, which, by the way, I wanted to read on air a little bit of this report because I think it's very important, okay? And we're going to do that. And we're going to do that in a second here. But if they wanted to find other people to listen to who may have a better take on their own voters, they would know this. They would have been prepped for this. But they're not, because they simply don't have, I don't know if it's the intelligence. It's worse than that, because I think we all know what was going on with Frank, guys. I mean, he's their friend. This is Kevin McCarthy's buddy. This is who's going to tell people how to. This is the guy. Okay, let's read real quick who Kevin McCarthy invited to explain to the Republican Party what it takes to win in 2022. This is Salon, all right? And I give the Daily Mail credit in the beginning, but that was wrong. We need to hat tip Salon. They got the initial beef. Are you ready? Former employees of famed GOP pollster Frank Luntz say his work is a scam. Legendary, here's the subtitle, legendary Republican pollster claims to be without bias, former coworkers say, but that's frankly bull. In parentheses. I got, Zachary, this was a good job. Seriously, credit where credit's due. This was a good job. This is a good report. Republican pollster and Kevin McCarthy, friend/roomie, Frank Luntz, isn't afraid of boasting about his personal achievements. Quote, Dr. Frank I. Luntz is one of the most honored communication professionals in America today, unquote, reads a biography on his website. But some of his former employees tell a remarkably different story. Chad Ingram, a former senior vice president at the lunch research company, who worked at the company from 97 through the early 2000s, told Salon that Luntz's claim to deliver objective data is a, quote, total shtick and a scam. A total shtick and a scam. I'm just recapping here, making sure I don't miss anybody. All right. Ingram described observing Luntz trying to manipulate focus groups that used dial testing. You remember the dials, by the way, guys? You know what I'm talking about. The dials. We do dials, but we are not there to influence them, by the way. Ours are totally different. You're not in the room with them. So I don't know what Frank is doing, being in the room. This is one thing that I have to stop here because this is a methodological beef right now. What are you doing in the room with them, coaxing them in one direction or the other? You could do this, by the way, nowadays with modern technology. They can do this. They can use like a web dial. And they can use their mouse and turn the dial or click in one way to suggest, a positive reaction, a neutral reaction, a negative reaction towards everything they may see or you may hear them do. We have video that allows you to take facial cues. But you are not there and should not be there telling them directions in the middle of this. They're provided the directions beforehand. You tell them what I'm going to show you a series of whatever. Please indicate positive, neutral, negative, however you want to do it. Scale from 1 to 10, whatever. And then you get the hell out of the room. Or you give it to them if they're doing it online. You're not there giving them some kind of advice or coaxing them along. Ingram described observing Luntz trying to manipulate focus groups that used dial testing, in which participants spin a small handheld device, yielding real-time results in response to questions asked by the presenter. Quote, Frank, when he would be hired by clients, whether they would be corporate or political, would sit in that room yelling, keep turning the dials, unquote. Ingram told Salon in a phone interview. Luntz's primary concern, Ingram said, was results that would yield more compelling data to be presented to the client, which in many times wasn't presented to the client, folks. Many times it was presented to you on Fox News, on Sean Hannity, on Fox and Friends, on CBS. The client you don't actually hear about, do you? You don't know who Frank's clients are when they have him on TV talking about which way the dials are moving. You were never told that. Ingram said that Luntz does not work as a impartial or honest survey researcher, but is better described as a pay-for-play pawn in Washington. In 1997, the American Association for Public Opinion Research largely agreed with Ingram's current analysis, finding after a 14-month investigation that Luntz had, quote, violated the association's code of professional ethics and practices, unquote. This was in 97 too, where APOR, which is what that stands for, APOR was a lot less politically aligned. All right. Luntz's keep turning the dials approach Ingram said, is clearly not the type of stuff that legitimate public opinion and survey researchers employ, unquote, adding that this was just one of the many examples. He described additional ways Luntz would deceive viewers and media companies with such tactics, including screening and selecting participants in a manner Ingram called viewer discretion advised language. Ingram called, quite frankly, bullshit, unquote. The clowns at MSNBC didn't have a clue about how the focus groups or panels worked, or what Frank was doing, Ingram said. Quote again, the actions were basically contrived. He screened out anybody that isn't going to give the viewers the opinion that Frank, on behalf of his client, is looking for. Somehow he is able to, I'm not going to say it again, bull people, unquote. MSNBC didn't return Salon's request for comment on this story. I bet you didn't. Luntz is a frequent guest on MSNBC, CNBC, and Fox News anchor Bret Baier's program. Maybe that's why you thought Iowa was a red state, Bret. Another one of Luntz's former employees who still works in the Washington area and asked to remain anonymous in fear of professional retribution, which he or she will no doubt get, spoke to Salon about Luntz's lavish lifestyle and summarized his former boss as a, quote, slimeball, unquote. A third former high-ranking Luntz employee confirmed to Salon the validity of these two other sources' remarks. That third person said they believe negative experiences from working with Luntz were widespread in Washington. That former employee, also granted anonymity by Salon, said that Luntz rarely appeared at his own company's offices during the workday, but often called employees to abuse them late at night. Luntz apparently doesn't want the American people to know that he took $77,900 Paycheck Protection Program loans for his company while living in his luxurious D.C. apartment. Listen, before we get into the documents, big data poll, neither big data poll nor the mother company took loans from the Paycheck Protection Program. That was wholly unnecessary. Our clients largely, well, we had some contracts that were canceled. I'm not going to get into it, but a soap maker, for instance, is like, oh, hold on, maybe consumer spending is going to go down a little bit. It's probably not the best time to start a marketing campaign to reach certain kinds of people. There were a few people, but for the most part, this kind of economic distortion doesn't hurt people like Frank Luntz, doesn't hurt companies like Big Data Poll. Could they do better? Of course. But are we on the damn soup line that he needed to rob the taxpayers of 80 grand? He couldn't sell any pieces of his fake Oval Office furniture? You got to be kidding me. Was Kevin McCarthy unable to pay his rent that month? This is criminal. This is criminal. According to documents reviewed by Salon, the pollster was granted a PPP loan in April of 2020 through his company FIL Inc. The loan, apparently designed to help pay 5 of Luntz's employees during the coronavirus pandemic, was first noted in a Washington Post report from fact-checker Glenn Kessler. You mean fake fact-checker Glenn Kessler. Who's probably doing everything he can right now to undebunk some of the stuff about the virus he tried to debunk, which is now clearly bunk. Throughout the pandemic, Luntz was living in his 7,000 square foot luxury condo in Washington, and his former employees all told Salon he had no business taking the PPP loan, which was ostensibly meant to help struggling small businesses survive. That money was meant for the restaurants, for the bars, for the whatever, who really couldn't do business. The government did not waltz into Big Data Poll or Luntz's luxurious apartment and tell pollsters that they could no longer take contracts. Physical commerce was halted. You can do meetings through Zoom. You can present the results You email them the PDF, the crosstabs, you take an hour out of your time, set up a Zoom meeting, and you present the results of the research to your clients that way. Luntz also owns a Los Angeles mansion. And I'm not, don't begrudge people for success. It's how they reach that success that really is at issue. Luntz also owns a Los Angeles mansion that includes a 3/4 scale replica of Bill Clinton's Oval Office and a replica of the Lincoln bedroom that features a photo of Clinton and Luntz on the bedside table with a version of Monica Lewinsky's infamous blue dress hanging on a wall. Is this slime or is this slime? That loan was meant for the Chef Andrews of the world. That loan was meant for the mom and pop stores, the antique stores, the mainstream stores, and others who were legitimately forced by the government to halt commerce. It was not meant for already rich, crooked scumbags who have no need because they're not stopping commerce. When you have friends like this guy has, you're recession proof. The only thing, in fact, that could hurt you is a non-political figure rising to the scene against everything that you tried to do to stop him without the help of people like you. That's the only thing that could really hurt someone like him. And defeating his friends on Capitol Hill. An exclusive Salon report earlier this week detailed that when Luntz presented himself as an impartial pollster running focus groups for Vice News and HBO in 2018, he was actually being paid by Ted Cruz's Senate campaign. In a statement to Salon, Vice News said it was unaware of this affiliation, and Luntz did not disclose this information at the time of these productions. Did he disclose to America that he was bought off by Purdue Pharma when he did his level best to hook the Midwest on Oxy? Is he telling his Twitter followers right now that every single vaccine tweet he puts out is bought and paid for by Pfizer, his client? Be joking. Luntz wrote a Los Angeles Times, and that's fine to have it, by the way. That is fine to do work for a media organization if you are working for a political candidate, as long as A, they are not related, the work is not related, and B, you disclose that relationship to the media organization. I personally don't like double dipping, so when I worked for the Epoch Times, I did not work for other clients. Why? Because your polling rate, it had a generic ballot on it. How could I poll for a congressional candidate? How could I poll for a congressional candidate if I am polling for a media company and providing the public a generic ballot? Now, I know people do that. Hart Research, they still polled for NBC while getting paid by the Clinton campaign. Personally, we don't like doing both, at least not at the same time. Unless, there are examples when you could, but this is not legit. Luntz wrote a Los Angeles Times op-ed last September presenting himself as a pollster without bias, a claim that may reasonably be viewed with suspicion. Quote, "As a pollster, I am ethically and professionally required to interpret public opinion accurately, factually, and without bias," Luntz wrote. All right, look, why is this such BS to me? With the exception of course, it makes my entire profession look terrible. It adds to why people don't trust us, and it's the most egregious behavior you can't abuse your work as a pollster any more than this. You can't. Selling the interests and the views of your clients as legitimate research while you rig the game is the worst thing you can do to betray the public trust as a pollster. Secondly, you might have noticed in the profile on yours truly, with the help of you guys who funded the public polling project, who did they get to just close out the profile on what we did? Who did they go to talk to round out the whole arguments we were all making about why myself, with the Election 2020 Public Polling Project, others like Jim and Susquehanna, why we were more accurate than others? It was Frank Luntz, who contributed to the last 2 paragraphs of that article. Part of the establishment who continued to blow it year after year. And they asked him, well, you want to respond to any of this? And he just couldn't swallow it and give any credible answer. But it's concerning that he would be the one they go to. Robert is hopped on right now. You know what? Because I'm about to lose my you know what. So I'm gonna hook Robert in because and then I'll just finish reading a little bit about what the profile from the New Republic said. But I mean, folks, holy crap! You have to be kidding me. And I'm glad this all came to light now. But this is disgusting. Robert, you're here, my friend. I've been reading about Frank Luntz and what a crook he is. Why don't I get your take on this? Do you see this article by Salon and the Daily Mail?
I did not.
Oh my God! That basically is former employees saying he's a total fraud. He sells his companies. He sells he sells basically the interests and the views. Everything I've been telling people. He sells the interest and of his clients and their views as legitimate research to a public that doesn't know better. He's the worst of us. He's a scumbag. And he took $80,000 in the PPP loan program.
That's funny.
I mean,
no surprise. I mean, he's the hustle. He's what they're really there to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you got to give credit where credit's due. This is why I like reading different news sources. Unlike liberals, apparently, compared according to the latest surveys. But this is why, look, you got to give this guy credit. I mean, this is not a hard person to go after. Zachary is the one who wrote this. Zachary Petrizzo. It's not easy to take on somebody like this with friends like Frank Luntz has. So, when somebody like Tucker does it, he's the anchor program of Fox News. This is someone in Salon. The Daily Mail takes some guts to pick it up and try to run with it and get, but this doesn't help us. You know what I do? This doesn't help us. And I was just saying in the expose, this is why. This is the kind of credibility he has built up with the media, including non-leftist media, right? So non-left-wing propaganda media in the thing about our project, our public polling project. Who rounded out the last 2 paragraphs of that? Frank Luntz. They called him to say, this guy did better than you again. You want to respond to it? And he tries to give this very diplomatic answer, but it's concerning that he would be the one that they would call in the first place, my man.
Oh yeah, no doubt about that.
I mean, it's just it's gross. It's just gross, and this pisses me off so bad. But I wanted to get you, now that I have legal expertise in the program, I think we should shift gears. It's just when I saw the PPP thing, man, that's what blew my freaking top. I didn't have an office and payroll to meet. It's the bottom line is though, and what we do, Robert. I don't want to say it's recession proof. We had and you know this. We had one client pulled away from a big project. They're like, man, maybe that's not a good time right now if consumer spending's going to drop. It happens, but we weren't on the soup. We weren't at the soup kitchen, man. We weren't waiting on the bread line because the government didn't force us to shut down commerce. It didn't tell us to close our restaurant, to shutter our doors. Nobody's allowed in your gym, Mr. Baris. Whatever other people did. That was what that money was for, man. That's what that money was for.
Yeah.
Trash, Robert.
Though it was really it was used for the politically protected from the get-go because of tying it into whether or not you had outstanding credit at a major bank. Things like that made it always so that the politically protected would be privileged in who got access. And of course, it was a massive restructuring of wealth, which we've witnessed and seen, and power to some degree, but definitely wealth. I mean, it went from mom and pop street shops to big tech billion. What the net effect of it all was. Now, I think that the inflationary concerns is putting a bit of a hedge on where they thought they were going. I don't think they can policy-wise be as aggressive. The combination of a poor jobs report and a bad inflation report was not what they expected, and you're witnessing that in their response.
I think that's all right, and the net effect. I mean, I think that's crystal clear, and I mean, maybe he's just a really good example of how all that money was just really redistributed. How much wealth was just redistributed during this thing. And yeah, I saw your video that you had up, but all the audits and stuff, and I wanted to ask you about that too, but I kind of jumped right over Ron DeSantis today. Did you see what he signed today in Florida, allowing Floridians to sue big tech? So theoretically, Robert, now, would I be able to sue Twitter, or would PBD Ventures be able to sue Twitter for this unjust, without response, without explanation, suspension that's been ongoing since November?
Yeah, I mean, it opens the door. They'll argue that Section 230 preempts the law, and they're going to argue in some cases that First Amendment prohibits it. But that the Section 230 preemption argument will be the big one. Justice Thomas put in his footnote in one of his recent opinions about non-binding opinions, but one of his opinions about big tech in general. He wrote two over the last year. He put in a footnote, cited an article from Eugene Volokh, who's the prominent free speech lawyer out of UCLA, who had written an article suggesting that the preemption component of Section 230 actually violates states' rights. So that will be the legal question that will then maybe we'll go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll see. But right now it's a good attempt at doing something. It won't likely have any legal consequence unless the U.S. Supreme Court steps in, or the 11th or somebody else on the court steps in and says that Section 230 cannot preempt these kind of laws. But it's a good way to start that. It's not immediate likely relief in the courts. It is setting up the legal battle to determine what the scope of the power is of Section 230, and puts the state in good position in case Section 230 is invalidated either judicially or legislatively.
Robert, how do you argue loss of revenue? Like, so how do you? Because I'm reading through what had the language of it. How do you quantify a loss of revenue from like a Twitter suspension? Like something like Google is easy. So YouTube, right? So you'll lose your super chat, stuff like that, right? So you'd lose revenue from monetization, and you'd be able to actually prove that. I just don't see how you could. Maybe there's a way, I'm just not getting it. But I don't see how you could prove that you lost revenue from Twitter suspending you. Maybe I'm totally off base and I'm totally wrong, but I just don't see it.
It depends on the business and the individual. So if you have somebody that's really tracking it, in other words, X number of tweets lead to X number of donors on an average basis, then you can have evidence for it. So like, it's easier in the Facebook context and the Google context than the Twitter context, for sure. Candace Owens, for example, I had no idea how much money she was making. That's another story. When she filed suit against Facebook because of their demonetization of her, that was a huge sum of money that she was making. But there's a much tighter track than there is with Twitter. But there are people who track that. There are people, like I represented a client who had tracked it and knew exactly how much money, for the most part, they had lost by being suspended and barred from Twitter. But for most people, Twitter's not monetary. It's only a small group of people that Twitter really translates monetarily. For most people, it's just having a voice, and that's what's suppressed, not monetary loss.
That makes more sense to me. I mean, for me, I'm actually surprised they went that route, because I just kind of view this two ways. Everyone goes the 230 route, and I get that, and I see the free speech argument. It sucks to be banned, man. It really sucks. I mean, Laura's still pissed. It's just like you want to get your voice out. You have things you want to say, so it stinks. It just blows. But at the same time, I view this as I view media bias, which is that I don't understand. I can't bring a candidate on this show and give them 30 minutes to try to convince voters why they should vote for them without being, objective or, having some kind of argument or interview. You can't give them that because that's like an in-kind campaign contribution. I don't, so I view this totally separate. So what Jack Dorsey does and Mark Zuckerberg does and even what the news outlets do, when Jake Tapper's assistants talk to the DNC, when his producer talks to the DNC and says, I'm going to have Donald Trump and Ted Cruz on the show today. What would you like us to ask them? I mean, that to me, that's in-kind contribution, Robert. That is illegal. You're giving them something for nothing. You're giving them something for nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that under at least some interpretations of the law, it is that way. My own view is I interpret the law very restrictively. So I think it should only apply to donations in cash and shouldn't apply to anything that's even labeled in kind outside of a clear, giving someone their campaign office and not charging them rent. Beyond
Right.
I worry more about regulatory authority than I do about and limitations on speech than I do people doing creative ways to basically fund campaigns.
You think it would just run amok if it was like that?
Yeah, I would be I'm not in favor of almost all these campaign finance laws. My view is they're all traps for the unwary. It's the unsophisticated who will get hammered with it. It will be selectively utilized. We've seen that throughout its history in terms of enforcement. And it mostly traps the little guy. The sophisticated actor knows how to get around it and always will. There's never been any means of truly repressing campaign finance activity without complete suppression of speech entirely. And so that's where I'm not. I find it's kind of like foreign aid. It's something that appears to be one thing, but actually is something different. That people think of it as something that's, about protecting against bribery and campaigns when really it's about giving an edge to the sophisticated crowd. It's like tax loopholes. They're just going to favor the privileged group that knows how to lobby and knows how to hire the lawyers. The same is true for like financial aid. I mean, if anybody thinks that our foreign aid is actually about humanitarian aid, they really haven't been paying attention for quite a while. I'm going to be debating Nick Fuentes tomorrow on Alex Jones's network. I think it's like 6 p.m. Central, about Israel and whether Trump's policy on Israel was the correct one. But it's amazing that I'll get people talking about, and Cassandra Fairbanks, we've talked about foreign aid. Folks, there's no such thing as foreign aid. There's bribery, there's extortion by the United States of various foreign governments using foreign aid to do so. But we're not out helping humanitarian, even if it's disguised as humanitarian aid. It's rarely is that our political motivation for doing so. So that's been a good book. 2 books: New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the Economic Confessions of the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and then so there's 2 of them, and then the King Leopold's Ghost is an excellent book, and see how much the Belgian king was about helping the people of the Belgian Congo. Lord Conrad bought that nonsense and went down there, and that's what led him to write his famous book about going into the jungle. So, which later led to the Apocalypse Now, is loosely based on that. So right. Yeah, but it is this kind of mythologies that exist out there. Fascinating.
Yeah, I remember my college years, and I almost went down a totally different path, and did an entire thesis work on why the Marshall Plan is like the only successful example of foreign aid, and it was just totally different purpose. Like you said, there is no aid. This is extortion and bribery and coercion on some level, and that's it. It's really it. And the Marshall Plan was totally different.
It's, we'll give you X amount. I mean, like right now, for example, interestingly enough, they removed the waiver that allowed a U.S. company that's a very secretive company that was pumping oil out of northern Syria. And the Biden administration has decided to no longer continue to do that. In fact, it looks like they're setting up steps, to my pleasant surprise, to get out of the Mideast in general in terms of armed military presence. It looks like they've recognized that strategy has failed. We'll see but there's actions afoot. But one of the things they did, the problem they had was the Kurds that were in that part of Syria, who have some degree of autonomy now because of U.S. actions by encouraging the Kurds to resist and causing the 10-year civil war now that exists in Syria. And they could have been pumping that oil themselves. So we don't want them to do so because it will interfere with whatever our political objective in the region is. So we're going to give them $50 million in cash. Now, that $50 million in cash is going to be disguised as humanitarian aid for the poor Kurdish people of northern Syria. But that has nothing to do with why the $50 million check is being written. It is solely and wholly to buy leverage and political influence in the region. I mean, that's where, like the the first impeachment of Trump, there was a kernel of truth to it, but it didn't apply to Trump. What it was reflected was everybody in Washington knows that all foreign aid is bribery and extortion.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's what that was the secret they're trying to hide. They're trying to act like no. We always make these independent decisions to help poor populations because we're these deep humanitarians, whether it's military aid or developmental aid or called humanitarian aid. We're just doing it for the poor peoples of the world. And then you get critics who are like, well, I don't want to see my money go into a foreign nation, not recognizing that has nothing to do with it. That's just the lies that the American politicians tell everybody. It's like the World Bank and the IMF. They're not there to help develop the poor countries of the world. Take our aid to Israel. That money's just there's not a dollar that leaves the United States borders. As soon as Netanyahu took over and he saw Obama was in the White House, he said, please, no more foreign aid other than military aid. That's why they haven't received a penny of foreign aid. That's why? Because he didn't want Obama's administration dictating his domestic policies. That's why. He's like, no, thank you. You keep the cash. People should ask themselves, why do so many countries, when they have populist-type leaders, reject foreign aid, right? If this is just free money. It's because it's never free money. There's no such thing.
He didn't want the price tag.
And often it's cycling the money. Either it's paid, like most of our military aid is Defense Industry Employment Act. And you can either like or dislike the Defense Industry Employment Act. The reason why Trump liked it is because it helped give us a market dominance in the arms space. Now, you may not like that. You may not, support us being a major arms exporter around the world. But one of the advantages of doing these kind of weapons deals is what you're doing is you're saying, we don't want you to develop these weapons. We don't want, particularly a nation like Israel that easily would and has a history of selling those arms when it's convenient for them. We're saying, no, you don't develop your own arms. You let us keep a monopoly on those particular kinds and classifications of weapons, and we'll provide those weapons to you instead. What that does is that keeps market dominance for the U.S. and the rest of the world that pays inflated prices in certain circumstances and isn't developing weapons for national security purposes we don't want other nations to have. Which I'll get into what's really going on with Russia here because Putin's done a smart thing on that space. But that's really sort of most of our military aid is about. The money never leaves U.S. shores. The money goes right back to the U.S. defense industry. And Trump's argument would be that's good for national security, that's good for market dominance, and the defense industry is one of the highest paying job industries in America. So it's a lot better than infrastructure projects that go to nowhere, like building bridges to nowhere. Defense industry, you could argue about whether you like bombs or not. I get that. But most of the foreign aid isn't actually sent anywhere. It's right here in the United States. The second part of it is the other thing we do is we say, we want you to build a dam or we'll call it development aid or whatever. Then that money still doesn't even really leave the United States because we pay the U.S. or Western engineering firms, consulting firms, the McKinsey companies of the world, all of those people. That's where the cash goes. The cash never actually goes into the pockets of some poor people in a foreign land. The closest thing to pure foreign aid around the world is the number one per capita beneficiary of that aid, and that's the Palestinians. They receive more foreign aid. You might tell you why they're not really eager to have a second state or anything else, because then maybe the cash would go away. The richest set of refugees in world history are the Palestinians. They make more money. They get more money per capita for the last 30 years than any group in the world. I mean, it's absurd the amount of money. I mean, how do people think Yasser Arafat, they figured out he was a billionaire after he died with all the money that was stashed in different places?
Yeah, I was just going to say, look at what they do with it, Robert. Look at what they've done with it over all of these years. It hasn't benefited the people of Palestine or whatever they want to call Palestine at all.
Correct. It's money for arms, money to, but that's because in part that's what keeps the money flowing. The moment they have peace in Israel with the Palestinians is the moment all that money goes bye-bye. All that power goes bye-bye. All those freaking politicians at the top, which is what Yasser Arafat half was. He was always half marketer, half terrorist. He was never really a genius terrorist strategist at all. I mean, he was a little nerd from Cairo, joined the Muslim Brotherhood, walking around his little tie until the commies came to him and said, hey, you need to look like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. And that's when all of a sudden he starts wearing the scarf and he gets the military outfit and he's always walking around with the gun. He wasn't some great soldier. Complete crap. The only thing the Palestinians have been good at historically is losing. That's and losing. They join lose, and then they whine about it. Like I only saw John Oliver.
That's what kills me with them. Then they whine.
They try to bomb Israel and they can't kill anybody. I mean, a lot of their bombs fall on their own people. That's how ridiculous it is. From the Gaza Strip, and more of their people died. This would be like arguing for the German Nazis. So the poor Nazis, the Americans and the Soviets beat them up because they were so much more powerful. I mean, this is preposterous. So but to a long story short, on foreign aid is not what people think it is. Foreign aid is about leverage. Foreign aid is about bribery. Foreign aid is often about paying off domestic U.S. industries. And they're just disguising it as foreign aid. The so-called purpose of it is foreign aid. But it almost never is. And that's why plenty of people actually reject it. So, but going to Russia, people have been trying to figure out why in the world Biden is suddenly reversing course on. I mean, he came in, rattling the war sounds, the war bells, as to Russia, and then all of a sudden, within the last 2 weeks, totally backed down, begging, meeting with Lavrov, Blinken did, begging for a summit. Now the Nord Stream 2, that ship had sailed many years ago. That was because the Germans won it. That's about Ukraine. It's not about Russia, really, or Europe, or the U.S. I mean, why the U.S. ever cared was beyond me. But it was only because of the Ukrainian coup supporters wanted to keep Ukraine with a monopoly on European access to Russian natural gas. And the Germans were done with it after Ukraine decided to shut it off for a while and to steal from it. They're like, oh, okay, we're not going to let that happen. So the Germans want the monopoly on European access to Russian natural gas. And so they begged Putin to build Nord Stream 2. It wasn't the other way around. He wasn't gung-ho on that idea at all. But he said fine after they did a bunch of agreements. So that ship had sailed years ago because of how many contracts were already written. But what's interesting is, the Biden administration is filled with people that are obsessed over that issue. Darren Beatty from The Revolver, he loves it. I mean, each day he trolls them, says, "Hey, how's the Nord Stream 2 opposition project coming?" Just to have fun with them. But the reason is this: Putin, for the last few years, apparently has successfully developed new weapons that pose unique risks involving nuclear drone submarines. And so I don't know all the details about it. Just saw it recently on the Duran. The Duran does a great job for everybody out there. They have a locals page, the Duran.locals.com. Also on YouTube, they provide like 5 to 10 videos a day, or at least a week.
They pump out a lot of content. Yep.
Yeah, a lot of great foreign policy, realpolitik content, non-ideological for the most part. Though they are in the Trump camp, but that's because they're realpolitik.
Realists. Camp. They're realists. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. And they're the ones that point this out. And as soon as they saw it, it's like, oh, this explains why all of a sudden we're begging on our knees, because we didn't realize, because Putin was smart. And this goes back to foreign aid, defense industry monopoly, etc. Putin understands its power to develop unique weapons. He's apparently succeeded at developing unique weapons that have changed the equation in the Biden administration. As all of a sudden it was like, oh, oops, Let's talk. Let's have a summit. We all love each other now. Well, we're not anti-Russian. We didn't spend.
Yeah, speaking to Lavrov is not a. Speaking to Lavrov's not a crime anymore, Robert. That's not a crime.
So sorry. Totally apologize. Like John Cleese, a fish called Wanda, when they're holding him out of the window. I totally and profusely and completely apologize. That's the backstory going on there. But it ties into for folks to remember why it's why Iran's trying to develop nuclear weapons. It's extortionate power. It's political power. You can say it's bad morally. You can say you dislike it. You don't like extorting foreign governments. You don't like bribing foreign governments. That's fine. But recognize that that's what it is. We're not writing blank checks to help poor people around the world. The idea that the CIA, Council of Foreign Relations, has been all for this for 50 years because we're really helping people. The closest you could argue for that would be the Marshall Plan, but even that was about self-interest. It was making sure that,
rebuild.
There was no re-empowerment of Nazis or anything else in Europe. And secondly, that was mostly U.S. contractors and U.S. resources being used. Yeah, and
that's why it worked.
It built up a momentary German and European middle class to buy American manufactured goods. I mean, there's a reason why the 1950s and early 1960s were the greatest time for American working class in the industrial era of the United States. It's tied into that, and that was why we really did it. Now, I think a lot of our current foreign policy is idiotic and doesn't produce those kind of outcomes, but people should know that's what's happening. That people are figuring out, we're going to bribe them this way, we're going to extort them this way, we think we'll pay off this way. Appeasing the Palestinians has never worked out. It didn't work out for the British, it hasn't worked out for the Israelis, and it hasn't worked out for the Americans. So I think that foreign aid is a waste of money. Cut off their cash like we did Iran, and all of a sudden they might be rediscovering how much they like Allah Akbar, to go forward in the political movement.
Yeah, I think too, and you said it before, that first impeachment, that should have really been, it's a shame that at that time there weren't more Republicans who were aligned with Trump using those things, not just that, but the NATO funding, that really exposed it too. Why do you think people, they flipped out over that? And who was doing the flipping out? The traditional GOP, neocon wing, the Romney kind of Republicans. This was never about morality. It was never about. This is so ridiculous that there are some people who still buy that, Robert.
Well, the neocons and neoliberals agree is they think the U.S. should run the world. And Trump didn't see that as the U.S. objective. He saw that the U.S. objective should be protecting American interests and nothing further and nothing more. And that's why he had a very consistent policy around the world on a wide range of policies. But his view was, rather than continue to worry about U.S. dominating Europe, let Europe defend itself. Thus, he was planning to pull all our troops out of Germany, and originally pull out of NATO, which would have been the right decision because NATO is simply creating
Warsaw Pact is gone, man. The Warsaw Pact is gone, man.
Conflict with Russia and the Eastern European countries, and it's classic Trump. He would just say things in a blunt way. So, hey, if we're going to go to the Mideast and fight any wars, we're taking the oil. That may be everybody's objective, but he just say it. Same with if they want a new policy for Venezuela, which I wasn't a fan of, but he's like, okay, I'll put Elliot Abrams in charge because this guy loves to overthrow government, so everybody can know what he's about. and in Europe, where with Ukraine, he was like, okay, all of our foreign aid is just bribery and extortion, so I'm going to put a little pressure on this schmuck. Why don't I get something out of this? And he just recognized it what it is. That was so ironic when you hear all these grandstanding politicians saying, "Oh my God, a politician using foreign aid to try to get a foreign leader to do something," when it's the only reason we do foreign aid. We don't. It's not aid.
It's all a quid pro quo, Robert. It's all a quid pro quo.
We do is quid pro quo.
It's the most ridiculous.
The Biden administration giving $250 million to the Palestinians, knowing some portion of it's going to go to Hamas, is because the Biden administration sides with Fatah against Hamas. And they think we give the money, we funnel it all to Fatah, then they'll be able to screw over Hamas. It won't work. It actually will end up in Hamas's pockets in one way, shape, or form. And the problem is the idea, the Islamo-fascist idea that animates so much of the Arab Islamic world is the threat. This is what Trump recognized. This is what Trump understood. His whole strategy had a coherent thematic structure, whether he was talking about Muslim immigration, whether he was going to Saudi Arabia to speak about how the Arab nations needed to unite against this threat, his Abraham Accords, his foreign aid that he was giving. All of it was about reducing the influence and risk of Islamofascism, because he understood Islamofascism is a problem for the West. It is a problem for the United States. And so that's why he did what he did.
Yeah, I used to love looking at those NATO back and forths, and then by the way, some of the pro-Petro, anti-Zelensky people that really could have been in some trouble if Zelensky and Trump were really tight. We're arms dealers. Adam Schiff's got fundraising buddies that run in those circles. I mean, so the prospect, Robert, that some of that money wouldn't have made it there would directly have hurt their friends. And that's number one. And number two, I mean, the uniparty outcry to that, it was complete. It was a little bit obvious. I just think it was a lost opportunity too, because it was so obvious. I think most Americans could have saw that and understood that, because they don't really like foreign aid. Americans don't really like it, to begin with. But when you go to yank it, then they put on the soapbox arguments. You know how it goes. Oh, if we don't give this, poor Ethiopian kids.
Is that well, they're right to be skeptical of foreign aid because it's not really foreign aid, and because they're not fans of doing it unless it's clear humanitarian aid under emergency circumstances. But even that, for people who don't understand, humanitarian aid itself is power, right? If you're the group this is why in conflict zones they won't allow humanitarian aid in. It's because humanitarian aid is, I have the resource, I have the food you need, I have the water you need, I have the medicine you need. Guess what that gives me? Power. That's what it gives me. So
without a doubt.
There's no such real thing as, outside of some circumstances like earthquakes, natural disasters, that's probably real humanitarian aid for the most part, without strings attached, without influence. But it's all ultimately a power game. And that's what people underappreciate and misunderstand. And it was probably a great blown opportunity. If Zelensky had gone in with Trump to create détente with Russia and reestablish Ukraine on other grounds, Ukraine and Central Europe would be much better off. The people that the Nord Stream 2 impacts is Ukraine. Ukraine's only leverage is their control over Russian natural gas access to Europe. As soon as Nord Stream 2 is done, Ukraine is done. They have no more political leverage. And Zelensky tried to go hardcore with the ultra-nationalists there. He's facing complete disaster because he's now got bad relations with the Russians. And once the Biden administration figured out they have a problem with Russian weapon development, they all of a sudden abandoned Ukraine entirely. Instead, they're lecturing him about putting his own oligarchic supporters in jail. We'll see how that works. While they're trying to put a Putin friend in jail just because he's a Putin friend, calling it high treason. Ukraine, I think that momentous decision to not allow that relationship to go a Trumpian direction will probably do devastating damage to the long-term capabilities of the Ukrainian society and government. Maybe one of the most fateful decisions in Ukraine.
Maybe. I totally agree. I've been thinking about that for a while. Actually, when the man was first elected, it was he put some people around him that were, I wouldn't say holdovers from Petro. I think he was just trying to make sure, from what I hear anyway, he was trying to make sure that things didn't just grind to a halt. And that, in Ukraine, there's not any real good guys. They're just bad guys and worse guys. So he just didn't want things to come to a grinding halt. And he figured maybe, like Trump, it's best to leave some people there that still know the rules of the game, how it works, who the players are, right? But they had a chance, Robert. They had a chance. Then Zelensky was a Hail Mary. And it was either going to work or it was going to end really bad. And I think we're really at this point, I think it's safe to say we're on the trajectory of it ending pretty bad for Ukraine. I just don't see where they go here. They have no friend in the U.S. anymore, not unless those old forces, that and people don't even understand this. Marie Yovanovitch, one of the most compelling witnesses, supposedly, of the Trump impeachment. They were all holdovers from the Obama-Biden era of Ukraine, U.S.-Ukraine relations. They were Petro lovers. They were Poroshenko people. They never would want somebody like Zelensky to win and take over. These people were loyal, and their friends, their connections were Poroshenko people. So for Marie Yovanovitch to go in there and pretend like she's just some poor civil servant woman who was driven out by the big bad bully, this is one of the most vicious women you'll ever meet. All right, she is hardcore, folks. She is nobody's victim. And I some really good work that a friend of mine has done on her. Unfortunately, in the West, it doesn't see the light of day. So it'll get picked up by European media. But she had been, with some bad folks, man. She was really partnered with some bad folks who still to this day are making a living off of pieces from the former USSR that are just not claimed. A factory here for sale for nothing. You make the right friends, you get all of that. I mean, it's just incredible. And she was always there to facilitate those deals. Always. And I don't really see what our interest would be in some Russian oligarch getting his hands, Robert, on a 10,000 square foot warehouse once used by the Soviets now for nothing on the cheap, and yet she could make that happen. Things like that. And that's not even her role. And the Ukrainians couldn't stand her, by the way. Like the everyday Ukrainians looked at that embassy in general as people who just constantly meddled in their own affairs, and they wanted them out, and they did not see us as a positive partner. They saw us as people who came in and were like, exploiting the problems with their country for our own gain. And guess what? They saw us that way because that's the way it was. And so, I honestly think it's gonna prove to be a tragic missed opportunity for Ukraine, because Zelensky is he needed help. He couldn't do this on his own. He's not even a real politician. He just could not do this on his own. So I don't want to I saw your tweet, and I don't want to get off too much. Pennsylvania, I went over Iowa this morning, speaking of, populist insurgencies. All right, I went over Iowa a little bit in the beginning of the show. And just real quick, by congressional districts, the only one, you have the first congressional districts, because these Republican idiots believe the likes of Frank Luntz and even Nancy Pelosi's own polling, right? Because it showed Republicans were not going to do well in the House. Or at least that's what the totality of it showed. Not all polling did, but the ones they listened to and cared about. They absolutely could have taken that last congressional district in Iowa. And Pennsylvania, they won one by the skin of their teeth. They missed Wisconsin 3. That probably could have went. There's just all of these opportunities looking at these maps I'm sharing with everybody. Look at Pennsylvania, Robert. You got to want to comment on that. The Democrats had the notable races in this special. They had the mayoral race. That was, they had the attorney general, Larry, whether or not he'd be canned, or district attorney, whether or not he'd be canned because of the rise in crime rate. That didn't happen. And they had all of their races that should have driven their turnout. And the electorate turned out to be R+2, which is more than it was in November. And funny thing, before this last presidential election cycle, Pennsylvania had been in 16, like D plus 11, 12 in the voter file. And then over time, you could see that chip away to D plus 10, 9, right? It is now D plus 6, which, just a spoiler alert, people. I'm going to tell people. It's 46 Dem, 40 Republicans. First time we've ever seen it since I've been doing this, I've never seen Republicans represent in the voter file 40%. And I even remember when we started this, it was high 20s. And then it started to climb into the 30s. Now they're a baseline 40%, Robert. Democrats are at 46, and they only made up 42% of the electorate in this last election that just passed, and Republicans were 44. Both lockdown provisions went down, propositions, and there was a special. It's incredible. So for Republicans out there who say, well, why would I vote? They're just going to rob my vote away. Well, look, Republicans in Pennsylvania didn't think that way. This last election, they had an impact, man.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. You might be able to pull up. I emailed the Philadelphia votes precinct results for the ballot questions.
Try to grab it.
Ballot, Pennsylvania legislature for getting on the ballot, which was the limiting institutional, the power of the governor to issue extended and continuous emergency public health orders from which all the lockdowns were stemmed. This turned out to be an institutional flaw that the Pennsylvania courts refused to remedy, where you have the governor basically taking away everyone's rights on emergency declaration and doing so for forever without limitation. This basically required he go back to the legislature to get approval and authorization for such deals, like should normally be the case, for anything that's any extensive period of time. And so they put both of those provisions on the Pennsylvania Constitution for the ballot, and I was very curious to watch how the vote would break down. So what's interesting is it was clear from some polling that the Trump supporters were strongly behind it, but not united behind it. There were still plenty of statist, lockdown oriented, fear mongering oriented Trump supporters. And so in order for the lockdown provisions to amendments to pass to limit lockdowns in the future, they needed some Biden voters to cross over. And I was curious whether, in particular, I didn't think upper middle Biden voters would cross over, and they didn't. There's pretty close correlation for the most part in parts of the upscale part of, say, Montgomery County, with the outcome in the Biden election and changes. Ultimately, changes 3 to 4 points. 2 different amendments. One ballot question too. And what was interesting is it was thanks to most working class Trump supporters held, not everywhere, but mostly held. You did see that this also is kind of a test to see how much mining mattered, in the sense that you had some people who voted for Trump in mining country who clearly only voted for Trump because of mining issues, because they weren't with him on lockdown issues or the rest. So like Greene County, there was about 1 out of 5 Trump voters voted against these constitutional changes. But I think that's because I think a lot of the Trump voters were mining voters, because that's mining country. But the key ended up being in Allegheny County. I think Allegheny County ended up voting for the constitutional amendments to limit the governor. And Philadelphia, rather than being 80-20 or something to that effect in favor of the amendments like they were for Biden, was only about 2-1. And the reason it wasn't because of the white upscale precincts, which voted to support the governor's voters, and the urban African American voters. And, like Ward 50, what you see is about a third. So it
took me a second, but I got it.
A yes vote was to limit lockdown powers. Same with Constitutional Amendment 2. It ended up barely passing. A lot of people watching it on election night thought it was going to fail because the mail-in ballots weren't in from Philly and Pittsburgh. But that's because they assumed that those would be 80-20 for the governor.
That's right.
The idea of Ward 50 voted for Biden by over 90 points, 90-4. Now, for Obama, in one of the 0 Romney precincts, wards, where Romney literally got 0 votes in a bunch of precincts in Philadelphia. Personally, I don't doubt that. If you know the urban black Philadelphia voters, they're rally behind the first black president, but they had no interest in Mitt Romney. That 0. So Trump did better, but in those precincts, those are heavily democratically organized precincts. For those precincts to go, have a third of the vote in favor of changing against the lockdowns was huge. So it shows the black working class, just like there was big Latino working class inroads made by Trump in the 2016 election that has been showing up later in state house races and some mayor's races in Texas and some congressional races. It looks like it may be the sign of a beginning of a permanent realignment. On lockdowns, many poor and working class black voters have problems with the lockdown. So despite the Democratic machine telling them to vote a certain way, and that usually keeps a high level of loyalty, if the Democratic machine had not had a position on this issue, it may have split even. So a third of support is amazing, black support. And it, thanks to working,
it's huge.
It was huge. Is why those amendments, again, not a majority, but just enough, way more than expected, was the key to those amendments passing to finally limit these unconstitutional lockdowns.
Yeah, I gotta say, coming, because I remember after the day after, people were like, well, why are you so confident that they're going to pass? Because they're still counting in some of these areas. And, I just didn't think that we were going to see, because it is true in some precincts, like you said, where we get these 95-5s, these 98-2s when it comes to presidential races. And maybe it's legit, maybe it's not totally legit, in some circumstances. I would like to look at Broward County, where we didn't get those ridiculous last-minute dumps. They were still overwhelmingly Democratic, but they mirrored a lot of the other vote that we had seen earlier in the night. It appeared in urban areas, even in suburban southeastern Pennsylvania, it appeared that those margins weren't dramatically different. So if that was the case, then, unlike the presidential election, it made sense that the party loyalty was less rigid than it is during a presidential election. So I'm looking at it, and they don't have the damn votes. This is looking like a 2016 kind of split where there's just enough. You don't have to win down there. You just got to keep the margin from being brutal and just bleeding like crazy. And it was enough. Interestingly, because it was, one amendment throughout the night appeared to always have, 1 or 2 point more support. And they both ended up roughly, Robert, at 52%. So it was, I wouldn't say... it's not overwhelming, it's not the right word to use, but, consistent is the right word. I mean, really consistent. And it also dovetails with something we were talking about earlier, which is this 30 to 44 age group, all right, outside of the urban-rural divide, this 30 to 44 age group that started to move Republican under Donald Trump is noteworthy as hell, because this is a working group. If you remember when we released Florida, one of the biggest criticisms when we released Florida was like, on what are the odds? There were people in the commenting box on Twitter responding, saying there's no way Donald Trump is ahead in the 30 to 44 category. When we saw how closely he got in Pennsylvania, Iowa, Ohio, he won them. All right, so this can't be done without working millennials saying, I just can't get on board with this anymore, man. I got to eat. And I think if Republicans aren't dumb and they can see the opportunity here, I don't know how you don't benefit from this politically going into the midterm elections. They own now, because this is the biggest piece of advice I could ever give people who are running on the right. These referendums force the party to take a position that the media tries to hide. So the media is like, they're not pro-lockdown. We're just trying to be safe, right? But you have these referendum votes, and it forces the party lines to be drawn, and it punches through the media filter, because somebody's got to argue for a yes and somebody's got to argue for a no. So Republicans should be putting these and other things, whether it's, you could overstep on the transgender issue, but critical race theory, right? All of these other wedge issues we know the American people do not agree with. If you put these on referendum votes, you will, number one, it'll be an 04 Bush-like phenomena, where Bush, I would tell you, he barely won re-election. The war in Iraq almost sunk him. He won because of the value voter issues that were on state referendums that year. It drove evangelicals and Christians in general out to the polls that otherwise may not have voted. Or, in flip side, maybe there were Democrat Christians, and they voted for Bush because they were there for that initiative. He barely survived Iowa, by the way. Iowa, Trump won by 10. He won by a few thousand votes. That's how he secured a re-election. Incredible how that happens, Robert, right? But, if they keep putting these things on the state ballots, and that's what drives your voter base to the polls. We've seen Democrats use it successfully with marijuana, felon voting rights. This is a no-brainer. And keep putting them on the ballot. If a liberal judge strikes it down like voter ID in North Carolina, do it again. Just keep doing it. You have no good reason not to do it.
Exactly. And the two things with this is that they also had a non-discrimination amendment. That was amendment, I think, number 3, passed overwhelmingly. Just like even in California, they said, they don't want any racial discrimination to occur. So, all the wokester racial politics, it doesn't have much support at all. And whenever it's on a given referendum provision, anytime that the lockdown issues directly have been put on the ballot, the pro-lockdown politicians have lost so far, whether that's for a recall petition or anything else here in Pennsylvania. And you're right, they should definitely include. I mean, in Arizona, the only reason it was close, in my view, was because there were enough voters who came out to vote on pot in November. And that got out a lot of people that otherwise just wouldn't vote. I mean, as your polling showed. And what happened was enough of them not only voted, but they voted down ballot, which was the open question, whether they would vote for anything other than the pot issue. They did. Why? I mean, like Democrats tried to do that in Florida by putting the minimum wage on the ballot. What they don't understand is a bunch of Trump supporters support the minimum wage.
No, that's not going to work.
They didn't get that wasn't going to create a big Democratic turnout. Pot will create a big Democratic turnout, things like that. But they're running out of those because they've already got them legal in enough places. So, but Republicans should return the favor by putting popular election positions, popular social policy positions that either the Trump base or religious base is motivated to vote on, and let them vote. Same with, they could put certain abortion restrictions that might now become constitutional for the second term and past. Put some of those on the ballot. Because a lot of these are much more popular than people recognize. And
that would put pressure on the court too, Robert. You were right, by the way. The right runs away from abortion, but only like abortion, very strict. When I mean strict, I mean something different than what probably most media people mean.
If people think preachers are running their lives, they're not happy.
That's right.
So, when it gets overboard like that, to where it's a ban, banning all abortion is both impractical and not likely to ever pass. But it's also just once you had RU 486, that was not going to be a realistic measurement. But what you could do is get rid of the most morally offensive and horrendous abortions. So, and like most of the European world doesn't allow.
That was just, they do. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Abortions. So, no partial birth abortion, no second term abortion, no third term abortion, except under unique life self-defense circumstances. And that's, that would make our law just consistent to a certain degree. Let's say someone is threatening your life, but not intending to. You still have a right to exercise self-defense. In other words, let's say someone loses control of their car, and their car is coming right for you, and they're trying to control their car, but they can't. And somehow stop the event from occurring. That's the case, factually. Or you die. You have the right to shoot them. So that's innocent life you get to take to defend yourself in that circumstance. So legally, I don't have a problem with the idea of self-defense always being an exception, where the mother's life is in danger and that being a mother's choice. Now, by the way, a lot of mothers would risk their own death to help their child live. But be their choice, not necessarily the state's choice. And a lot of the pro-life movement has been looking at beat bills. Recognize that you tell most people, do you think someone should get an abortion once the fetus has a heartbeat? Most people don't like that idea. And the other reason is they don't feel like the preachers and the priests are taking over. They're like, okay, if you made a mistake, you can get an abortion in the first several weeks or up to 2 months before the heartbeat starts at week 8, week 9. And then it's like, okay, it's kind of on you from the political perspective. It's kind of on you to not exercise that option then. Well, why do you need to do so at month 3, month 4, month 5? Of course, a lot of those abortions, and this is another smart pro-life movement, are done because they think the kid will have Down syndrome or have other mental limitations. It was very smart to start passing laws to say you cannot do an abortion because or after you get a diagnosis of Down syndrome or autism or something like that. I thought the strongest political argument for the pro-life side has always been we don't want to devalue life across the board. So focus on those aspects of abortion that really are about devaluing life. Partial birth abortion being the most egregious, but other forms also, late term being egregious, and so forth. And it's nice, it's smart for them, and they should put those kind of issues on the ballot and test it. Now, there's different people. I am seeing some people overutilize exit poll data to interpret 2020.
Always.
Told people for many years, they're highly unreliable. Catalyst put out a report, and their data about who voted percentage-wise within a demographic is usually very, very good. Their assumption about how those groups voted is not very good. It's almost entirely driven by exit poll analysis. So that came up and said, man, Trump lost all kinds of support with working class whites. No, I'm sorry. Look at the precinct data I have. There isn't evidence for that at all. There was sporadic support, mostly based on the degree of mail-in voting. So, working class mail-in voting Democrats who normally didn't vote, voted, and that helped them. But otherwise, outside of that, Trump generally improved amongst working class white voters. Not only did he get a lot more votes in that category, his margins improved.
That's ridiculous. You don't lose when you add 11 million votes.
Quit looking at that. Look, we have, as to this data, you have a lot of precincts. Like I was trying to argue with someone about the Norwegian vote in Minnesota. And I was like, look at the actual Norwegian areas. They trended for Trump. The problem was the Scandinavian areas and the metropolitan areas. It was, the biggest problem in Minnesota is half the vote. We discussed this before the election. Half the vote in Minnesota and half the vote in Michigan is urban. Only a third of it in Wisconsin is urban. That was a sign that Wisconsin was more viable for Trump than Minnesota or Michigan. And that turned out true because of the huge metropolitan bias against Trump. But that's where it was good to see the metropolitan areas be nowhere near united for these lockdown policies. And it shows all these people that said these lockdown policies were really, really popular. Well, why did they even lose Allegheny County? Why did they lose a vote in Philadelphia? These positions were never popular. It was always bad advice and a bad idea to ever be on that side. But they should definitely put a lot more of these issues on the referendums to MEC, and particularly on election reform and religious issues, and social issues. Put those issues on to get out the people that really care. Put critical race theory on the ballot.
Damn right.
Effectively did that in the school board elections in Texas, and what happened? Over 80%, against critical race theory. Critical race theory is not, well, it's, as your polling has shown. These transgender policies of allowing biological men to participate in biological women's sports, of going into locker rooms and restrooms based on gender self-identification. These are not popular policies that the Democrats are pushing. Another example of this is Israel and Palestine. If you're on Twitter or you're on YouTube or you're on Facebook, you think that the entire Democratic Party is hostile to Israel and is inside with Palestinians, and you think probably half the country does if you follow the media. But CBS put more anti-Israeli people on than pro-Israeli people on during the 11-day war. But if you look at YouGov did a poll that amazingly the media just managed not to cover, and they asked people, do you side more with the Israelis or do you side more with the Palestinians? And it was less than a quarter of the people that are in favor of the Palestinians, including Democratic groups. They're not. There isn't this big. It's only on social media that they've convinced their little echo chamber that they think the Twitterati think that and just because there's unison in left opinion on YouTube on being anti-Israel doesn't mean that's the way the politics actually shake out. There's a reason why Andrew Yang kept his mouth shut while running for mayor of New York and wouldn't say anything in favor of the Palestinian cause. There's a reason why Biden tried to just keep his mouth shut for the most part. It's because he knows the loud voices in his party are Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and AOC and the Twitterati and the YouTubers, but they do not represent the majority sentiment even within the Democratic Party.
Schumer at his press conference, man. I'm not taking any questions on Israel. What?
Yeah, exactly. Of course not. He knew what he was going to say, of course, but he knows. I mean, it's that there's not enough people have studied and seen the issue over time. So particularly if you're over 45, there's very few people over 45 that think it makes any sense to be on the Palestinian side. Just it doesn't. And that's true for Democrats as well as Republicans. The second aspect is it's sort of another preview for tomorrow's debate. But there's this mythology out there that where people just can't figure out why Republicans are on the Israeli side rather than the Islamo-fascist side. Aside from that being, should answer the question that answers itself. It has nothing to do with, like, I saw these articles, there must be some Israeli lobby or the AIPAC or
so ridiculous.
It's real simple. They're called evangelical Christians, and they've been pro-Israel for forever, for a wide range of reasons. And that's why. I mean, that's why Tom Cotton and every Republican make sure to, and Ted Cruz rush to the microphone to support Israel. It has nothing to do with Jewish voters. They're 70% Democrat. It has nothing to do with Jewish donors. They're about 5% of all donors, period, and most of them are Democrat.
Most of them, right?
Fellow Christians, many of whom have studied this issue in detail for decades, think that if you're on the Palestinian Islamo-fascist side, you're not on the American side. You're not on their side. You're not on the right side. As well as, of course, Trump supporters who understood the cohesive nature of Trump's policy. Trump, from day one, recognized the great threat was Islamo-fascism. That's what his Muslim immigration ban was initially. What he was trying to highlight was there's a dangerous idea afoot amidst this population, and we got to deal with it because it's the threat. It matters a lot more than whether secular, autocratic, royal, or democratic leaders are governing in the Mideast. This is the great threat. And that's how he defined everything. He's like, I don't mind Saddam Hussein because he was against Islamo-fascism. I don't mind Bashar Assad because he was against Islamo-fascism. I don't mind Gaddafi, or didn't mind him because because for the most part, sporadically, he was against Islamo-fascism. I mean, depending on what day of the week, but for the most part, at least he didn't create an Islamo-fascism.
Or his interest. Yeah, his interest in the moment.
Yeah, Trump thought the color revolutions were idiotic. He was like, before the color revolutions, you have secular autocratic leaders in Syria, Egypt, and Tunisia. To some degree, you could say Libya was sort of an extended version of that. And afterwards, what do you got? You got ISIS in Libya. You got Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. You got the Muslim Brotherhood temporarily in Tunisia. And you have civil war and an ISIS group in Syria. And so Trump was like, how's that any good? So that's why as soon as he came over, he goes down to Saudi Arabia, does a speech to the Arabian League saying we all have to agree it's time to purge Islamo-fascism from the Mideast.
It was well received, too, that speech. It was well received. This is what the media here didn't tell anybody.
Exactly. Everyone, they didn't recognize. That's why no one could figure out why is Trump pro-Israel, but against the neocons on regime change. Because he realized regime change facilitated the rise of Islamo-fascism. Because he realized Israel is the number one defense in the region against Islamo-fascism. And that's why he aligned with what happened is the Saudis were coming to this conclusion on their own accord. But that's how he got the Saudis back in the gate. That's how, and got the Gulf states back in the gate. It was, hey, we all need to align U.S., Israel, and the royal states against Islamo-fascism because that's the greatest threat to all of us. And that's why he was able to succeed in that realm. But there was a complete coherence to Trump's focus. But I was asking questions. The reason is that people, anybody who's really studied this issue, but that's not a big part of the population, admittedly. But evangelical Christians are why there is no big Palestinian group outside of a few outside Detroit and a few commies in a little university. Just because they're popular on Twitterati, just because Glenn Greenwald and George Galloway and Michael Tracy and Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal, his daddy was Sidney Blumenthal, need to say more, any of those groups being anti-Israel, they are in the minority. There is almost no voter base in America for an anti-Israeli, pro-Islamo-fascist position outside of the academy. And they'd be lucky they've only elected 2 congresswomen. And it's not for lack of trying. Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib. Those are the only ones they elected. And AOC can hold power, even though probably within her own district, most voters oppose her position on this issue. So the reason why everyone else is on the side of Israel is because that's where the votes are. That's not because of donors, not because of media, not because it's up to the media and the donors.
AIPAC doesn't even
the issue. It's
AIPAC is a minor player, Robert. In the grand scheme of things, AIPAC is a minor. Look, guys, go to
AIPAC
opensecrets.org.
Israel, what the NRA is to the gun control. It has nothing to do with why the policies are there. On gun control, people are anti-gun control because a bunch of voters are anti-gun control. Because a bunch of voters are Second Amendment voters. It's nothing to do with the NRA. That's the left's mythology. So when I see this mythology repeated, it must be AIPAC.
We need a straw man.
Many of the funders of AIPAC are evangelical Christians in the United States. AIPAC is not a foreign-based government money. That's all U.S. domestic money. And it's a combination of Orthodox and conservative Jews, who are the majority, and evangelical Christians. That's who it is. Because evangelical Christians also recognize, aside from a historic alliance with Orthodox Jews on political issues going back centuries, Israel has kept Jerusalem free for complete religious tolerance. Christians that live there, and Christians have lived there for 2 centuries. Not 2 centuries, for 2,000 years. Since the time of Christ, Christians have been there. From the time of the Christian Revolution. The AD 0 is time to be Jesus' birth. So, but the second, or correspond to it, but also because pilgrimages and the rest. If you're a Christian, and you want to visit the Holy Land, Israel completely protects your ability to do so. Completely makes it possible. By contrast, when the Jordanians took over Jerusalem in 1948, what did they do? They kicked all the Jews and Christians out, and you couldn't visit at all. And there's no Christian that thinks it's safe to travel anywhere in the Islamic world, definitely to live there. Just ask the Coptic Christians in Egypt.
I was just going to say, you can't even go to Egypt, Robert. I've always, I had years ago, I had a client who was filthy rich, man. There's rich, and then there's filthy rich. Like, you have a jet. And he knows I love Egyptology. I do. I'm a history guy, but I really love ancient Egypt. And I was actually talking about Akhenaten on Twitter earlier. There's a lot of likeness between Akhenaten and Donald Trump in that. And I said it after the election, they're going to try to Akhenaten this guy. They're going to try to chisel everything, every mention of him out of history, right? But he even said,
monotheist. Historically, he's the first guy to recognize monotheism. And
that's right.
I believe he was partially the inspiration for Judaism becoming politically.
That's the argument. That's absolutely the argument. Yeah, he was long before Abraham said, he heard a voice. So this guy had friends in Egypt. He even still had business interests in Egypt because I don't want to say what he does, and somebody may figure him out, but basically, the entire country needs and the entire world wants telecommunications. So, so basically, I'm afraid to have taken him up on his offer, which was borrow my plane and my pilot and take your wife to Egypt. And ever since Obama, I just not felt like this is a good idea anymore at this point. Even when they had all elements of ISIS and everything, there were exhibits that had been up for years and years and years that had to basically be taken down and hidden. You can't. I personally do not feel safe walking around that country, which was among the most stable Arab countries for most of my lifetime. And then on the other thing I wanted to tell you, if you are 40 or 45 and above, like you were saying before, then you remember the pre-Iron Dome Israel. So if you could have even have been a kid watching through the 90s and even the 80s and watching the horrific, what happens when there's not a shield wall protecting you, and when there's not a missile defense system to stop thousands of rockets from raining down in a metropolitan city. Folks, the images, if you're not old enough to remember and you're one of these young people buying this crap, then I would really impress on you the importance of going through the archives. And you could be a mother with your kid sitting at a table at a cafe, and 1 minute you're there and the next minute you're not. You're just somebody riding a commuter bus, man. 1 minute you're there and 1 minute you're not. We forgot about all this, Robert. And it's like, because the Israelis can defend themselves a little bit better, we're supposed to feel worse for the Palestinians. Gallup's been polling this for years. Palestinian support is nil. Is it been a little bit more in recent years because of academics and, the nonsense propaganda in Western media? Yeah, but it's still a small minority. You would never know that from being on Twitter. I feel like Israel, because the West, and it's almost the same thing that happens with conservatives in this country, the West handicaps their ability to really secure their existence. And I feel like in this current state, they're just really managing their own decline. I really feel that way because they're letting in people. Look, this is reality. There's a reason why Japanese immigration policy is the way it is. They're letting in people who don't,
or the way Arab immigration and citizenship policy is the way it is.
That's absolutely. And I mean, you're just
what Arabs are up to by confession through projection, which is
That's
what
right.
are the Arabs doing? The Arabs are ethnically purging every part of their country now for half a century, making sure no Jews exist there, no Christians exist there. Why is that? That should tell you what they plan on doing if they get control or power or a second state in Palestine. I mean, there should be no doubt about that.
And yet, though, we're supposed. I think that generally it's Christians and Jews, no matter where you are in the world. It's just that it's more pronounced for Israel because they have a state. They're a little state surrounded by an Arab world. They can't do what's necessary, and I think we all know what I'm talking about. You cannot allow a group, to be over. They're surrounded by political and militant enemies. They're surrounded by them, and at this current state, they're just going to keep letting more and more in, and eventually, I just don't see how you survive like this. I don't see how you exist like this.
And that's what people don't realize. I mean, by religious and political tendencies, by what was happening in the 80s,
you're going to lose long term.
The Israeli population should be a labor-leaning group, has historically founded by labor socialists, and yet now the Labor Party almost doesn't exist in Israel. And the reason is because they've witnessed the failures of the peace movement. The peace movement said if you negotiate with Arafat, the peace movement first said if you don't discriminate against the Palestinians in any way in the West Bank and Gaza, and give them free access to all kinds of Israeli services and build up schools and healthcare and roads and bridges and an economy for them, that they'll respond by rewarding you. What happened in 1988? They started the first Intifada. Yep. I mean, for almost 20 years, there was no problems. You could have free travel between the Palestinian regions and Israel. They only started putting up walls and defense mechanisms when the Intifada started, which only happened in 1988 because Yasser Arafat recognized that in the post-Cold War era, he needed to reinstate terrorism within the population as opposed to doing it outside. That's what the Palestinians had been doing from 67 to 87. They did all their terrorism outside of Israel because it was beneficial to their population to have the free access they did. He does what he does. And then in 1993, he convinces Clinton. I mean, classic. First of all, just go back to Arab general, like General Khalid and other great generals of the first Arab empire, the first Arab caliphate. Those guys, you know what they would do in almost every war? I like military history, so I study all these, read all these histories of how this battle happened. Every single time, he would sucker the other side, whether it was the Persians or the Byzantines or some other competing group. He would sucker them into, hey, why don't we do it this way? And then we'll just meet out here. And then he'd ambush them and then bring in people from the side or bring in people from the back. I mean, he must have been thinking, well, how stupid is everyone else in the world that we can lie to them repeatedly and get them to appease us? But they've been doing this now for centuries. It's the Arab method. I'll never forget someone told me, oh, no, they're Muslim. They can't lie. And I was like, wow. I mean, that's the best lie of all. They can't lie. If you understand anything about the Persians, or the Arab whole history is built on lies. That's what they do. But that's how they gain political power. And you can agree or disagree with it, but that's their method. But this naivete. But Arafat convinced Clinton that Clinton was going to be a hero, that he was going to bring peace to the Middle East. And all he had to do was put maximum pressure on Israel. And that's how the Oslo Accords start. And Clinton was all excited. He thought by 2000 there was going to be peace. They were going to be building statues to Bill Clinton in Palestine and in Israel. He was going to be one of the greatest ever. He was going to top Carter. Carter had some of these naive concepts as well. And what they did is now the critics, the Israeli right wing, was saying, no, here's what's going to happen. He's going to use this so he can move back into Palestine and reestablish his terroristic base. He's going to do this to create even more funnels of cash to him from the UN and other groups. He's going to do this to force Israel to humiliate itself and shake hands and vindicate and validate the PLO and he personally on the world stage by shaking his hands in front of the White House, saying that's his objective. He's never going to do a two-state solution. And Netanyahu briefly came to power. Clinton hated Netanyahu, even though Netanyahu did almost everything Clinton asked. He even met with Arafat, even tried to do those things, damaged his own political base. Ehud Barak comes to power in 1999. And in 2000, they're at Camp David. And Clinton is all pumped because he got Barak, the Israelis, to give up everything, to give up 95% of the land, to give up a complete second state on their own property in ways that would severely risk their security, particularly on the West Bank. Give them a second state recognition. Give them $30 billion. And what did Yasser Arafat do? Sorry, gotta go home, boys. And Arafat was being reasonable. At the time, they blamed Arafat. What Arafat was told people later was, I don't want to have tea with Sadat. That was the Egyptian leader that cut the deal with Israel that was assassinated afterwards because he did so. He said, I can cut this deal, and they're going to have my coffin pretty soon out in the streets in Palestine. Because they so radicalized. Now, this is a population that had always been radicalized, but it's deeper. They continued and accelerated the radicalization by appeasing them with money, by appeasing them with publicity, by appeasing them with celebrity, by appeasing their leaders and grifters to empower and enrich themselves. They have created a permanent group of people who, that's why when they poll, West Bank and Gaza Strip have the most anti-Jewish. I don't say Semitic. Is that really
very radical? Very radical.
Bigotries and prejudice and violence and no coincidence. They gave up the Gaza Strip. They moved out of the Gaza Strip. They even left them a flower industry there. What did Hamas do? They blew up the flower industry, and then they started waging war.
This.
They started smuggling back and forth to Egypt, getting in. And Israel's concerned, Ben, if we don't keep control of this border, they're going to bring in a bunch of weapons. And the Israel peace movement said, no, they just want peace. They just don't want to be occupied and oppressed. What a bunch of idiots. No, they want to drive you to the sea, and they don't plan on stopping in Israel. The whole goal of building an Israeli empire, not Israel, Islamic
an Arab
empire,
yeah.
a Muslim fundamentalist empire, an Islamo-fascist empire, is to conquer the world. Just go read what the Muslim Brotherhood said in 1929. They said,
Robert, our FBI. We're not allowed to have these conversations. This is the material the FBI seized that led to Eric Holder largely shut that down. Even the Bush administration wasn't doing with the Holy Land Foundation. The FBI found the documents that basically held real true to their founding principles, and it was a strategy of replacement. And that's this is like. It's the entire Western mentality that we're just not allowed to acknowledge this. Now we're going to be real hush-hush. And this is crazy. This is like, shut up and sit still and wait for your extermination. Like that is what people want Israel. And by the way, it won't stop at Israel. That is what they want for the West in general. This is mad. It's madness that you just...
It was never even Israel. Israel was just the perfect example for them to use. But if you go back and read materials, it's always been about conquering the West. The West is evil. It's not if you paid attention to this, you would know in 1978 when Jimmy Carter's people were saying, no, Ayatollah Khomeini is really just a protester fighting against injustice, and he just wants social justice. You would know, you could have predicted that a year later he'd be calling us the Great Satan. It's because it's what they've been saying for a century. The West is the evil source of all problems. Islamofascism. People forget. Well, what set the protest movement in Iran against the Shah? The idea that they would let women vote. That's what happened. And I'm seeing these feminists champion Hamas and the Palestinian cause. I was like, are you insane? It's like all the feminists in Tunisia who are like, holy cow, now that we did a color revolution, they want to oppress all women. Oh, we didn't mean that. Well, who did you think you were in bed with? I mean, come on. Anybody on the left or anybody
LGBTQ
anywhere, should be is someone to never take seriously again. I cannot take seriously anyone on foreign policy who sides with the Palestinian side, and particularly the dumb lies they repeat. They're like BLM dumb lies. There's no coincidence. BLM is on the Palestinian side too. But these
shocker.
These are occupied people just being oppressed who are trying to fight back against their oppressors. How stupid are you?
And the danger of this is those that give in fuel their theology, because when they do get these concessions, it's like further proof that Allah is on their side and backs what they're doing. I mean, this is that's, if you were paying attention to the rise of ISIS, that was their greatest recruiting tool. It's like, look at all of these wins, Allah's on our side. And giving in, like you're going on about Bill Clinton, I remember those years. He really did. I mean, what Robert was saying, folks, was 100% true. He really thought he was going to be the great savior of the Middle East. And the sad part about it was a lot of people were. It had a backfire effect, though, here in America, because people were rooting for it. They were. And I think it was like, on both sides.
The reason why there's no longer a Labor Party of consequence in Israel is because they all figured out that they were wrong.
It's garbage.
They just hate you, and they want you killed. They could care less about having their own land that they govern. They only care about having land they can govern so that they can kill you. That's their objective. I mean, that's why they sing those songs from the time they're 5 years old. Watch a Palestinian pageant. Oh, we're going to kill all the Jews, and we're going to have little 5-year-olds singing this. Man. I mean, it's Israelis have slowly woken up to this, and now that's why there's almost no support for a two-state solution. No support for the Palestinians, other than the other thing that shocked them is the behavior of Arab Israeli citizens. Right? They're like, hold on a second, we give you citizenship, you get free health care, free social, all kinds of social benefits, all kinds of political protection. You have more rights and more wealth than you would anywhere in any Arab Muslim country, anywhere. And yet now you're going to be pulling Jews out of cars and beating them up on the streets like took place over the last 2 weeks. It's a mindset of Islamofascism that is extremely dangerous, that we should be focused on suppressing and limiting its power anywhere and everywhere in the world. Not to the degree we send troops anywhere, because that just encourages it. But in every other capacity, absolutely. And anyone who's thinking otherwise is just naive. And there isn't, so that's the realpolitik perspective.
That's the nice word. That's the nice word. Naive. That's the nice word, Robert. I mean, that's
absurdly naive. And it's just the Israelis were disabused of that naivete for, as you mentioned, 20 years of suicide bombings on school buses, at discotheques, at weddings, and at children's schools. Oh,
yeah. I forgot about the discotheques. I forgot. I mean, because there's just so much. Everything was a target. Everything was a target. I mean, people, go back and look at the archives. Go back and look at it. Once upon a time, Israel did not have the technology to blast most of the rockets out of the sky. And they hit. And they hit people. And there were horrible midday scenes for everybody to see.
They weren't putting up a wall in the West Bank initially. They weren't trying to secure access.
That's right.
People could just come flowing over. And what were they doing? They were using an opportunity to blow up cars, blow up buses, blow up homes, blow up properties, blow up weddings, blow up discotheques, etc. And it was just brutal and vicious. And that's why everything Israel has done has been defensive for their entire history of those Jewish settlers. Everything has been defensive all the way through. And
even some of what you... Yeah, go ahead.
I said most American voters know that. And the other aspect is, truth is, on the right, particularly, but also now we saw on the left, it's while you can be anti-Israel without being anti-Jewish, everybody who's anti-Jewish tends to be anti-Israel. And sooner or later, it bleeds over. Like, I got a kick out of it. My niece, who's nice little lefty in New York City, can do journalism, was kind of shocked at the anti-Semitism that occurred with Palestinian protests. Yeah. It's like, have you not been listening to what they've been saying for over 100 years? We want to kill the Jews. We want to kill the Jews. We want to kill the Jews. That's who they are. That's who they've always been. Yes, it's going to bleed over into anti-Semitism. Just like a lot of Nicholas Fuentes supporters, a lot of them are anti-Semites who believe a bunch of anti-Jewish, Jew haters who believe in some of the stupidest, looniest conspiracy theories on the planet. People have asked me, I'm doing the debate as a favor to Alex Jones, but do I take the kid seriously? No, I don't. When you entertain half-wit, nitwit conspiracy theories that come from the Islamo-fascists and the Nazis and the Soviets, and that are shared by Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, I'm not going to take you seriously. You haven't found out a secret truth. You're just another dupe and another rube in a long line of dupes and rubes who believed what evil, powerful people wanted you to believe about a group of people.
Yeah, it's 4:10. Why don't you go ahead and pitch that to everybody so they know where to find this and watch this? I'm going to be watching it. I saw the challenge. I just didn't think he had accepted it at that point. I think, he was beating up on Ruben and others on Twitter, if I remember correctly. And, I just, most of the time when you find people like that, they don't say yes, So, like, I've probably issued, I don't know, countless debate challenges to other pollsters and people in this profession. They just never do it. They take a pot shot on Twitter and then run. This is going to be one that's actually going to happen. So where can people see it? What time? And give them the pitch.
Yeah, so I believe it's 6 p.m. Central Time, 7 p.m. Eastern, if I recall right. It will be. You can go to InfoWars and there'll be a link. So I think he's creating like a free news TV site, separate site to try to get around all the censorship to be able to broadcast it. And so I think Alex is going to host it himself. So that'll be fun.
Interesting.
On the Jones has been so anti-Islamo-fascist that he has people. Jones is secretly working for Mossad. And all this nonsense. These people that think they found something incredible when what they've stumbled into is one of the dumbest, oldest, most vicious conspiracy theories spread by idiots and nitwits and malicious and malevolent actors for the last, really 2,000 years. You're on the side of the Roman emperor, the same Roman emperor who was busy throwing Christians into live lions' dens where everybody could watch them get devoured. That's whose side you're on. You're on the side of the Inquisition-era Catholic Church, the medieval Catholic Church, that didn't like people wandering around with their own views and being able to be literate. That's whose side you're on. You're on the side of the Nazis. You're on the side
blasphemous reader.
You're on the side of the Islamo-fascist terrorists. So it's amazing. People ask me all this straight. How can you be on this side? I'm on Donald Trump's side. You're on Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib's side. Maybe that's how I can be on this side. But it'll be a fun debate, and we'll see how much he's sincere versus. Part of his background strikes me as a trollish provocateur, not really a serious intellectual, not someone who's serious about this. But we'll see.
Why I was surprised.
To show
That's
how
I was surprised is happening.
Yeah, to see how much a lot of his Groyper. The reason why there's people against the Groyper movement, because I get inquiries on this subject, it's because they harass people routinely, because they're pricks. Because they're not people to take seriously. They're not smart enough to be taken seriously. That's why people like me don't take you seriously. Act like an intellectual, act with some civility, and you'll get the respect of one, even if I think your ideas are wrong. But act like a prick, and I'm going to treat you like a nobody prick. So so we'll see which one he is, and that will shape the. I'm going to do my style regardless. But
how do you respond to somebody who just comes up with crazy? If it does turn out that it devolves into conspiracy peddling stuff, I guess you could just the only thing maybe it won't. Maybe he shows. Maybe it won't at all. I'm hoping for somebody who comes with, like you said, sincere and with some actual a factual argument, not something like the Bible is fake. Did you know it wasn't even written all those years ago? They didn't put. I've heard some doozies, man. The Old Testament was put together 20 years ago.
The Jews were behind everything. It's like even somehow they're behind World War II, getting 75% of the European population killed. That they're still behind that. It's like, at what point does the cognitive dissonance start ringing some bells? But but putting all of that aside, we'll see how much. There's a part of him, I think, that's serious and straightforward. Came up as a young conservative intellectual type. I'm skeptical of the reasons for shifting to what strikes me as a lot of anti-Israeli sentiment seems more anti-Jewish to me. When I hear other conspiracy theories being voiced, it's like, and I don't know if that's sincere. I think that's trolling for a base. because there's a group of people
maybe.
out there
Yep.
just haters. And they'll give you money. I mean, apparently he's been receiving substantial funds from some of those groups. Who knows what other groups he received money from? I mean, some of these people don't even know that a lot of their source, because they may be anonymous and whatnot, are actually, government of Qatar and its cutouts throughout the American world.
Oh, there's tons of that.
Of Muslim Brotherhood. People can watch a documentary Cernovich did on this several years ago called
Yeah,
Blood.
I was just gonna. Yep. I was just gonna mention that. That was fantastic.
The secret Arab lobby is a lot bigger than any Israeli lobby in the United States and the West. And so, there could be those issues. A lot of people credited him on speaking out on the elections. He said a lot of aggressive rhetoric leading up to January 6th and then managed not to be there on January 6th at the Capitol. Kind of, it might make you curious. So we'll see.
I mean,
is he a serious person or is he a troll provocateur who's being paid by bad actors? I don't know which one it is. We'll find out.
We'll find out. I'm gonna be watching it. I was really shocked it was even going on because there's just so much that's. But maybe if he is looking for a base, then you would want to show up in debate. It's just in order to earn that base, you have to perform, right? So you have to. I mean, otherwise, well, maybe not. Maybe there's just there is an element on the right that's anti-Jewish, Robert.
Oh,
there is.
And that was the other thing. I wanted to purge any followers I had that were into anti-Jewish conspiracy theories and the rest. I don't like dealing with them. Don't like them. And also, it's look, folks, your mama dropping you on your head when you were a baby ain't nothing to be proud of. And that's what a lot of these people are. And so I don't. It's not only that I dislike it from a moral perspective. I find it unconscionably and incredibly stupid. I find and I'm not going to waste my time with
dangerously stupid. Like, you could be really giving parts of the world and your own communities over to Islamofascists
who see Israel as being assigned with the neocons, and so they're anti-Israel because they're anti-neocon. There's that group of people out there that I understand. I really think financial aid is actually financial aid, and have bought into, and sometimes they don't know they have bought into anti-Jewish conspiracy theories that make no sense. A lot of my friends on the left that are anti-Israel buy into every half-assed nitwit conspiracy theory that exists. Now, they can't survive a debate for longer than 15 minutes. Noam Chomsky got taken apart by Dershowitz at several debates over the years. Dershowitz was pointing out the risks involved, and Chomsky said, Lebanon, back in the early 1970s, Lebanon was the great example for the future of the Middle East. How did that work out? I mean, that's how these people aren't predicting things. So my view is that to the degree
it was once the pearl in the Middle East.
Yeah, the part of the audience out there, or the people out there that really are just uncertain about the facts, don't like how the neocons are in bed with, use Israel as their justification for regime change wars, to explain what the real scope of the situation is. That's just a pretext for neocons. It has nothing to do with really being pro-Israel. That's just the neocons are looking for various fig leaves to justify their various policies and politics. Mostly, the neocons and the neoliberals agreed since 2000 that the solution was to have democracy unleashed in the Mideast and remove all the secular.
They absolutely did. They all bought into Bruce Russard's democratic peace theory, even though he couldn't even defend his thesis in academia. People really just don't. It's amazing. It took over the entire foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C. The guy was a failed student. He had to start redefining definitions of what really constitutes a war. All right. So, like, if it's this many vehicles and they're using these kinds of weapons and this many troops, then that's a war. But if it doesn't fit with my thesis, I'm going to exclude. And they just took them apart. They just took them apart, and it made it into a book, and that general democratic peace theory became Bill Clinton's basically foreign policy and his doctrine. And then from 2000 on, you had the Paul Wolfowitzes on the neocon side and the neoliberals now they're like neoliberal, but they were liberal internationalists from Bill Clinton's era. They just totally agreed on this. And that somehow, if we made the entire world a democracy, we wouldn't war with each other. It's ludicrous. Honestly, John Mearsheimer, in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he spends less than a few pages on destroying him and moves on. And that's like a real thinking book, a real foreign policy book. He doesn't even dedicate that much to it. He eviscerates Russ and the whole crew. He eviscerates them. But like, look, you may be able to redefine things, for idiots who don't think, but here's the real empirical evidence of why this is a failed theory, and he demolishes it. And it's like I said, it doesn't even take that long, yet everybody in DC believes it still to this day. There's no evidence to support it.
It's sort of three baseline belief structures. One was the old belief that capitalism naturally leads to democracy and humanitarianism.
Right.
That was their excuse for empowering China. Oops, that didn't quite work out. The second,
you opened the door, all right.
Would unleash humanitarianism and capitalism. Oops, Muslim Brotherhood everywhere. And then third was a lot of leftist-derived ideas, that these were occupied people under colonial rule, and they were just fighting for their freedom and independence and democracy, and sticking this sort of dualistic Marxist analogy, Hegelian analysis on a dispute that wasn't about that. And what is, a lot of people confused, they saw the United States and the West, and particularly the United States, and they saw a society that the rest of the world would want to emulate. And they assumed that the reason why the United States was the way it was because of its political system and economic system. When the political system and economic system were an expression of who American people are.
Damn right.
One followed the other, not the other followed the first. The chicken
Absolutely.
egg was the original cause was America's moral values, political and philosophical commitment to freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, inspired by the Christian tradition, particularly. And that's what and formulate, and because they've been oppressed by the state churches. So their method of Christian evangelical beliefs was about encouraging freedom of thought, freedom of discussion, freedom of religion, because they had been the victims of that oppression, and they believed that was the most persuasive mechanism. As, by the way, many Muslim clerics in Saudi Arabia now do when they realize the Wahhabis created the bin Ladens and then created all the other problems, and ISIS in part and all the rest, Al-Qaeda in part. That's why the Saudis royal family is like, screw you guys, we're shifting gear. No more of this. This did not work. But that's why also the West has been notably critical of Saudi Arabia for the last 4 or 5 years, if you notice. Highlight, that anti-Saudi operator went to the U.S. Embassy. That's what he really was. He was an anti-Saudi operator.
Washington Post writer, my butt.
Saudi treatment. That's all. A little chap, little chip. But that's it. Don't go into your enemy's embassy when you're trying to overthrow the government. Just a word to the wise, everybody. Right. But that's the sort of backstory of what's happening. But that's the big flaw. And what's amazing is this ideological flaw still exists at high-ranking positions in the State Department. Though it does appear Trump put enough people in that even Biden is getting advice to follow Trump's policies instead of Hillary's intended policies. So
he was the only realist.
Maybe a great Trump legacy yet to come in the Middle East. We'll find out.
He was the only realist president we've ever had. That's it, at least in my lifetime. Reagan was close, but he still fell for the human nature and condition crap.
You could sucker Reagan on a whole bunch. If you just put the communist, non-communist filter on it, you could sucker him on a lot of stuff. I mean, that's why Reagan funded the Taliban and the Mujahideen. And he invited. I mean, there's some embarrassing photos with him in the White House with these guys. I mean, he should have looked around and thought, maybe these are people we shouldn't be aligned with. Just like, Eisenhower had photos with one of the co-founders of the Muslim Brotherhood. And you read the internal State Department files, and they're like, by the way, this guy's a fascist. He's a hard, crazy fascist, just to let you know. But Eisenhower's like, oh, no, this will bring us peace in the Middle East. We'll bring him in. And unfortunately, they convinced Reagan of that. Hey, these are freedom fighters. They're fighting the Soviets. Man, they got long beards and seem to want to hate people. Okay.
Al-Awlaki was on Bush's one of his very first Muslim reach out programs. Al-Awlaki. I mean, I don't know if it's how much is true, but there is, of course, the other side of the story that said he made Awalaki radical by like breaking promises and stuff. I don't blah blah blah. I mean, there's maybe I wouldn't put it past the U.S. government to screw somebody over.
And I was reading what they were written before U.S. had anything to do with that entire region of the world.
Yeah,
and they're planning then their attacks. I mean, why were they anti-Jewish settlers in 1920? Why are they staging riots in Jerusalem and beating up and killing any Jewish person they could find? There was no Israel then. That was 28 years before Israel existed.
Yeah.
This goes all the way back to Islamofascism. They believed that the presence of the West, the presence of foreigners, was preventing them from being able to impose Sharia law and have an Islamo-fascist empire. And that the great problem was that these people existed at all. I mean, that's what they really believed. And once you understand that's their core belief, that nothing's going to change, that Khomeini's father had been shot and killed because he was involved in those kind of political movements in early 1900s and then what was known as Persia before it was known as Iran, then you would understand that this was coming. And what's amazing is I was on the Israeli peace side back in the 1990s due to meeting Israeli peace activists. I watched all this, and as I saw that the peace activists were always wrong about what was going to happen, and the Israeli right was always right, particularly, frankly, Netanyahu, who I'm still, I don't always agree with certain tactical decisions he makes, but he's been way more right than wrong. And that's just realism. And then when you study the whole history, you understand what's going on. And once you understand that, then you can predict things much better and not have these naive, dopey ideas that lead you to end up being aligned with some of the worst people in the world.
Yeah, and just dovetail off what you said before, too. One definitely preceded the other. Maybe if I was already on this, it was already on the way out when I was in college, right? So we spent 5 to 7 days on a 60-page pamphlet called, by Marx, but 300 to 350 pages, depending on the edition, of Max Weber, you gloss over in a half a day. It's probably the most important book for understanding Americans' political and economic system, or at least the beginning of it. Which I'm talking about, people. It's Max Weber with a W, The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism. It's the most important book. That's why Britain's capitalist system is not like ours and never was, and was, and France, you name it. We have a unique. And like you said, Robert, it's like we are spiritual. We're religious, the history, but not institutionally. And that it's not rugged individualism, and it's not pursuing wealth for the purpose of greed. It's once you really understand what their thoughts were and frugality, right? I mean, mammonism. It wasn't for that. And these were frugal people. You were expected to labor because God wanted you to labor. He liked you to prosper. This way you wouldn't be a burden on the rest of society, number one. And if your fellow brother and sister were in a rut, you could help them. You could be in a position to help them. It's a very unique worldview. And that's what, like Robert said, that's what led to this system. It didn't go the other way. So imposing the system on others who don't have those values isn't going to work. It will never work because
over and over again. In fact, it
over and over.
The worst in their populations because of the problems that occur.
So true.
So, I mean, and so hopefully we'll recognize it. But yeah, it should be a fun debate. So
can't wait.
Depending on how sincere he is, but I don't care how sincere. I'm going to make my argument independent of whatever he does.
Yeah, I can't wait. Be looking forward to it. I'll be checking it out. And as always, Robert, people can find you at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, vivabarneslaw.locals.com. Locals is growing. We're both stoked about it. Robert, this is it. The best thing you told me was to join Locals and do a Locals page. This is the only place. It's a different kind of. It's not. Twitter's just so ugly compared to Locals. It really is. The community has much better conversations, and you guys get exclusive content with Robert. You'll get exclusive content with us, and you guys should definitely think about joining if you're not members already. See you next week, Robert.
Manana.
All the best, folks. See you tomorrow. All right, folks, check that out. If you're not going to, I'm going to check it out. It's going to be great. But as always, Follow Robert on Twitter still. You can do that at Barnes Law or at Barnes_Law. I think it is like me at Peoples_Pundit. But definitely check out both our locals pages. We will see you next week. And what are the odds? And tomorrow's Robert's debate. Wednesday is Inside the Numbers at 11 o'clock. For people who missed, we'll go over Iowa a little bit. But then we'll get into Pennsylvania, which is an incredible story. I think Pennsylvania is moving faster than the numbers even suggest. I think the numbers are having a hard time keeping pace with the shift that's going on in Pennsylvania. And you know that if you've watched these voter analysis and you realize voting behavior 90% plus, that the voter file is not typically right on the money, obviously. People vote, some people don't. So the electorate is different than what the voter file is. It's showing you the overall population of it. So check it out. Pennsylvania is an important story. It's going to be hard. If this keeps up, it's going to be hard for Democrats to maintain dominance there like they have in all of these years. Trump made inroads, but at this point, I think he may have started something that if Republicans keep to those principles, that's a snowball. And it's just rolling downhill. And it's hard to stop. I don't think Chuck Schumer stepping in front of it is going to have that big of an impact. I think it's going to pick them up and roll down the hill with them. All right, so Wednesday, 11 a.m. Thanks for watching, folks, and we will see you tomorrow at 7 for Robert's Debate. All the best.
The lights that shine down over dotted lines of white across an open highway, restless nights, coffee houses, clubs and neon lights. I rock the people, my